Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we travel deep into the folds of time, where cold winds lash across endless sheets of ice, and ancient humans wrap themselves in furs, not yet knowing they carry secrets that will echo down through millennia. Beneath the soft crunch of snow underfoot and the muted howls of wolves in the distance, something unexpected begins. A mutation so subtle, so quiet, it won't be noticed for thousands of years. It doesn't come with a fanfare or a lightning bolt from the sky. It happens in the eye, not a vision, but a change to the iris itself. Blue, glinting against a world of white, a flicker of something new. They probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Ice Age doesn't care about beauty standards. It doesn't blink at the idea of blue eyes. It just grinds forward, slow, silent, and glacial. Around 10,000 years ago, as the Pleistocene epoch draws to a close, the world begins to thaw. Sheets of ice retreat like embarrassed guests overstaying their welcome, exposing patches of fertile land, rivers, and dense forests. In this fragile window of transition, Homo sapiens spread northward into Europe. They're lean, resourceful, and mostly brown-eyed. That's the thing, brown is default, dominant. Practically every person walking the earth at this time shares the same shade in their gaze. It's not dull, it's rich and deep and speckled with gold in sunlight. But it's also uniform. No one is even imagining another colour. The very idea of a pale iris would have seemed as mythical as a winged horse. Still, the world is changing fast. Glaciers are melting, sea levels are rising, and animals are shifting habitats. Humans are forced to adapt, altering diet, clothing, shelter, and territory. And within their cells, quiet revolutions are taking place. DNA, ever the trickster, occasionally miscopies itself. Not always in catastrophic ways. Sometimes it creates quirks, harmless oddities like freckles, dimples, or eventually sapphire-hued eyes. Somewhere near the northwest shores of the Black Sea, a child is born with an odd sparkle in their gaze. The year? Impossible to pinpoint, but it happens within a span roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. A mutation in a gene that regulates melanin, the pigment responsible for colouring skin, hair, and eyes, means this child has less pigment in their irises. Not none, just less. Enough for light to scatter across the surface and bounce back in blue. Let's pause for a moment. Blue eyes aren't actually blue. They contain no blue pigment whatsoever. What you're seeing is Rayleigh scattering, the same phenomenon that makes the sky look blue. It's a trick of the light, bouncing and bending in a way that turns the absence of melanin into an ocean-coloured illusion. So technically, blue eyes are just pigment-deficient brown eyes with a good PR team. The mutation responsible is in the HERC2 gene, which controls the expression of another gene called OCA2. Think of it like a dimmer switch. HERC2 turns down OCA2, which in turn limits melanin production in the iris. Scientists now believe every blue-eyed person on Earth today shares this exact mutation. They all descend from that one ancient individual near the Black Sea. One ancestor, one tweak, one improbable moment. Historians still argue whether this mutation happened once or multiple times independently. Some suspect parallel mutations in isolated populations. Others believe in the singular origin theory, one change passed on through generations, amplified over time. The evidence leans toward the latter. The genetic signature of blue eyes is remarkably consistent across populations, like a single verse repeated across many songs. At first, the child likely stands out, but not in a way that leads to myth or celebration. There's no Bronze Age Vogue issue to highlight this peculiar beauty. In fact, it may have been viewed with suspicion. Early humans were deeply connected to their environment, and deviation was often interpreted as danger or omen. A child with light eyes could have sparked whispers around the fire, blamed for failed hunts or sick cattle. But just as likely it was ignored, blended into a life of skinning reindeer and dodging wolves. The environment itself, however, plays a key role. Northern latitudes get less sunlight. Melanin, while protective against UV rays, can be a liability in low-light regions. Lighter skin and eyes allow more sunlight in, which helps the body synthesize vitamin D, critical for bone health, especially when diets lack fish or sunlight is scarce. Over generations, natural selection nudges the population toward lighter traits. The blue-eyed gene, rare at first, gets a foot in the door, but it doesn't explode overnight. This isn't a fashion trend. It's glacial, literally and figuratively. For centuries, even millennia, blue-eyed individuals remain a genetic curiosity. A few among many. Still, each generation carries the potential for more. And sometimes, in tiny nomadic groups, chance does more than natural selection ever could. If a small tribe happens to carry more blue-eyed individuals, and they interbreed mostly among themselves, the trait flourishes. It's the founder effect in action. A small group with unique traits can define a whole population over time. One quirky theory that pops up occasionally among speculative anthropologists is that blue eyes might have conferred a social or mating advantage. They're rare, after all, striking. In a sea of rich, dark eyes, someone with pale, piercing ones may have been perceived as special, even magical. Could blue eyes have been the ancient equivalent of a peacock's tail? A flashy, inefficient trait kept alive by attraction alone? It's not impossible. Evolution isn't just about survival, it's also about sex. Traits that help individuals attract mates, even if they're biologically neutral or slightly risky, can persist and flourish. That's why humans still have chins, nipples on men, and the capacity to enjoy music. Function follows fascination. So imagine, deep in a pine-scented glade, or along the edge of a frost-covered river, two individuals sit across from one another, one with dark eyes, one with light. There's a flicker of interest, something unfamiliar and compelling in those pale irises. An evolutionary seed is planted not through survival but through curiosity. Of course, not every theory sticks. Some fringe ideas go a little too far, claims that blue-eyed people are descendants of aliens, Atlanteans, or ancient gods. Harmless fun at midnight maybe, but lacking any real scientific footing. Still, these myths are telling. They speak to how much we've always been drawn to the unusual, to difference. Mainstream archaeology gives us better clues. In Mesolithic burial sites across Europe, we begin to find evidence of people with light eyes and dark skin. Yes, dark skin. The stereotype of the fair-skinned, blue-eyed European doesn't apply in these early millennia. Skin pigmentation takes longer to shift than eye colour. Some of the earliest blue-eyed humans probably looked very different from modern depictions. One skull from Spain, dated around 7,000 years ago, belonged to a man with blue eyes and dark brown skin, a hunter-gatherer. He was short, lean, and likely moved often with the seasons. His DNA tells a different story than his bones. It's like discovering a photograph that blinks when you're not looking. As the centuries roll forward, ice continues to melt, seas rise. The land bridge between Britain and continental Europe disappears under waves. Farming begins to creep in from the Middle East. New genes, new diets, new diseases. And among it all, the blue-eyed gene continues its slow, quiet march, travelling in bloodlines, whispered through marriages, passed along in lullabies and lullabies again. Even now, the mutation remains recessive. Two brown-eyed parents can carry the gene quietly for generations until, bah! A baby with irises like cold fire. A trick of genetics. A glimpse back to the shores of the Black Sea and a child who blinked at the morning light in a way no one had before. There's a strange poetry to it. A silent mutation, carved by time and tide, that today graces billions of photographs, art, advertisements, passports, and driver's licenses. But it started here, with that one twist, in the middle of a world waking up from 100,000 years of snow and silence. So the next time someone compliments blue eyes, they're admiring an accident. A beautifully persistent accident. A reminder that we are all, at our most literal, the sum of ancient typos. And sometimes those typos sparkle. Long before the first glint of blue ever shimmered in a human eye, the world was a canvas painted in earthy tones. Brown. Deep brown. Warm hazel at best. For tens of thousands of years, every person to ever live, love, hunt, cook, carve, dream, and die looked out at the world through irises rich with melanin. There was no concept of eye colour variety, because variety hadn't yet entered the scene. The entire species had evolved this way, and for good reason. Melanin wasn't just cosmetic, it was survival. Our earliest Homo sapiens ancestors emerged in Africa, where the sun was not something you politely avoided. It was a constant, scorching presence. High levels of melanin in the skin, hair and eyes protected these early humans from the relentless ultraviolet radiation, reducing the risks of sunburn, eye damage and folate degradation. Brown eyes are essentially nature's sunglasses, thick with pigment to absorb and diffuse light before it can do harm. In equatorial zones, they were not just useful, they were essential. The earliest human populations had no reason to evolve anything else. Natural selection is a lazy, stubborn sculptor. It chisels only when absolutely necessary. And for hundreds of thousands of years, there was no pressure to change. Blue eyes simply weren't in the cards. Every archaeological dig from Paleolithic Africa to early Australasia tells the same story. Brown eyes, and more brown eyes. The genetic palette was limited, but thoroughly practical. This long, uninterrupted dominance of brown-eyed people helps explain why the eventual emergence of blue eyes is so startling. It's not just a minor update, it's a dramatic departure, like discovering a polka dot penguin in a world of tuxedoed birds. But to appreciate the magnitude of this shift, you have to understand the world in which it occurred. Tens of thousands of years ago, the world map looked nothing like it does now. Europe was locked under ice. The Sahara was a green, fertile land. Sea levels were so low that people could walk from what we now call Russia to Alaska without needing a boat or even getting their feet wet. Human migration during this time was slow, dangerous, and deliberate. Groups moved based on necessity, following game herds, seasonal plants, or avoiding other, more hostile tribes. These were small bands of hunter-gatherers, numbering maybe 20 to 50 individuals at most. They lived in tight units, often intermarrying, sharing food and stories and, crucially, DNA. The genetic diversity in any one group was limited, and this had major evolutionary consequences. In such isolated communities, even minor mutations could become dominant purely by chance. But up to this point, there had been no mutation favouring light eyes. Brown was the default setting, the biological status quo. And in the intense sunlight of the lower latitudes, it remained unchallenged. The first true challenges came as humans began to trickle northward. They left behind the heat of Africa and the comfort of familiarity, entering Europe and parts of Central Asia. These regions were colder, gloomier, and often blanketed in snow or shrouded in mist. The sun, when it appeared, did so weakly, like a shy guest at its own party. Suddenly, the survival game changed. Here's where things get interesting. The adaptation to new climates didn't happen all at once. It happened in fits and starts, over thousands of years. But the signs are there in the fossil record. Early European Homo sapiens, around 40,000 to 30,000 years ago, still carried the dark eyes and skin of their ancestors, but their skeletons tell us they were gradually adapting. Shorter limbs for heat retention, lighter skin tones beginning to emerge for better vitamin D synthesis, and eventually the appearance of mutations that would lead to light eye colours. Still, for all the shifts happening in the body, the eyes remained stubbornly brown. Until roughly 10,000 years ago, every Homo sapien had eyes the colour of polished mahogany. There's no cave painting of a blue-eyed hunter, no stone carving that hints at it, no ancient legend whispering of someone with eyes like the sky. Because the sky hadn't yet touched the human gaze, it's difficult to overstate how long that uniformity persisted. Consider this. Humans had fire, language, tools, and even art long before they had blue eyes. The first musical instrument, a bone flute, is over 40,000 years old. The first stone tools date back over 2.5 million years, and yet, all that time, the eyes that saw and shaped those tools were the same rich brown. Blue eyes are, by comparison, an extremely modern invention. They post-date agriculture, they're younger than the wheel, they're practically toddlers in evolutionary terms. But what about those who weren't quite Homo sapiens? Did any other hominin species dabble in lighter eye colours? Well, here's where things get murky. While we have DNA from Neanderthals and Denisovans, the evidence about their eye colour remains inconclusive. Some Neanderthal genetic variants seem linked to lighter pigmentation, but it's not definitive. Historians still argue whether Neanderthals had light eyes, or whether the DNA we've recovered is too degraded to give us a clear answer. Some fringe theories suggest interbreeding with Neanderthals might have introduced certain pigmentation genes to modern humans, But again, it's more mystery than certainty. What we do know is this: brown eyes were a constant companion across nearly every ancient population on Earth. From the sun-blasted plains of Africa to the icebound caves of northern Europe, brown-eyed people built tools, raised children, and made their mark on the world. And they did it all while staring through irises that had barely changed in hundreds of thousands of years. Then suddenly that uniformity broke. Not overnight, not in a dramatic one-generation shift, but it broke nonetheless. A genetic typo crept into the mix, a soft rewrite in the coding of HERC2. It didn't cause disease or deformity. It didn't confer immediate advantage, but it made eyes look different, just different enough. Picture it. A mother with dark eyes peers into the face of her newborn child, expecting the same gaze she's seen in every baby for as long as she can remember. But there's a strange paleness there. Not grey, not quite blue, just lighter. It catches the sunlight differently. People notice. They whisper. They wonder. At first, this pale-eyed anomaly would have been rare, an exception in a world of consistency. But evolution doesn't need to make a fuss to change the world. It just needs time and repetition. This mutation, passed quietly through generations, began to show up more often, especially in northern populations where small group sizes and genetic drift could magnify even the smallest variation. This is how brown eyes began to lose their monopoly, not through conquest or catastrophe, but through soft persistence, a recessive gene here, a bit of chance there. Two brown-eyed parents could still produce a child with blue eyes if both carried the hidden mutation. It was like nature playing dice, and every so often, blue came up. It wasn't yet the age of blonde Vikings or porcelain-skinned nobles, but it was coming. Slowly, invisibly, the foundations of a new kind of visual identity were being laid. Blue eyes were still outnumbered, still fragile, still young, but they had arrived. One fascinating tidbit often overlooked in textbooks. Some ancient depictions of gods or mythic beings in Mesopotamian or Sumerian art show figures with inlaid eyes. Materials like lapis lazuli or white shell were used to mimic bright, possibly blue, irises. Historians still debate whether these were purely symbolic or inspired by rare, real individuals. But even back then, the idea of a light eye seemed special. In some ways, this rarity helped the trait survive. Human beings are drawn to difference, novelty, the odd shimmer. Even today, marketers know this instinct well, highlighting bright eyes in ads, using blue contacts to create impact, idolizing celebrities with piercing gazes. It's a deeply rooted impulse, and in small prehistoric tribes, that impulse might have meant a slightly higher chance at partnership. Attraction often favours the unusual, the exotic. Blue eyes, though not functional in a new way, may have been emotionally or socially magnetic, enough to pass down, enough to grow. But still, for the moment, they remained the exception. In the vast family tree of early humans, blue eyes were just a fragile offshoot, barely noticed, hardly widespread. The true explosion would come later, with agriculture, settlement, and society. That's when traits stopped being dictated solely by survival and began to be shaped by social preference. But for now, blue eyes were just different. And in evolution, sometimes different is all it takes. So the next time you look into someone's pale eyes, remember, what you're seeing didn't exist for most of human history, is not ancient, it's not original, it's a whisper from the recent past, a barely 10,000-year-old ripple in the vast river of time, a flicker of frost in a world once made of fire. The mutation that gave rise to blue eyes didn't ride in on a thunderclap. It didn't crash through human history like a comet or a saber-toothed cat. It was quieter than that. Quieter, but no less extraordinary. One small tweak in the blueprint, just a single nucleotide change affecting the OCA2 gene via a regulatory switch in the HERC2 gene. That's it. A microscopic flick of the evolutionary wrist. Yet that subtle nudge turned a universally brown-eyed species into a kaleidoscope of eye colours. It introduced not just blue eyes, but eventually greens, greys, and the more elusive amber shades. But blue was first. This genetic hiccup is now estimated to have happened between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, somewhere near the northwest shores of the Black Sea, what is now Ukraine, Romania, or the general Balkan region. Imagine that. The first true blue eyes emerging near the water's edge, blinking beneath an overcast sky, pale as moonlight on river stones. A quiet revolution, gazing out at the steppe. The key figure, though unknown, unmarked by name or grave, was Patient Zero, the genetic ancestor of all blue-eyed humans alive today. This is not speculative whimsy. Geneticists have traced the origin of the blue eye mutation to a single common ancestor. That means every person with blue eyes today, every Hollywood actor, every Nordic baby, every schoolteacher in Scotland or shepherd in the Caucasus, shares a distant link back to that original individual, an unknowing pioneer of pigment. This moment wasn't accompanied by fanfare. No cave murals celebrating the baby with the ice eyes. Life would have continued with its usual demands: hunting, tool-making, feeding children, staying warm. The infant's eyes might have caught the attention of a few villagers, perhaps even sparked local superstition or fascination. But in a world ruled by survival, novelty often had to wait its turn, and yet novelty has a way of sneaking into the fabric of human culture. Blue eyes weren't just new, they were noticeable. Under the muted sun of the northern latitudes, they stood out against the colder landscape like patches of summer sky reflected in puddles of snowmelt. In tight-knit prehistoric communities, even the smallest difference could echo through generations. At first, the mutation may have seemed meaningless, just a strange quirk. But the social ripple effect? That could have been profound. Human beings are, and always have been, visual creatures. The eye is more than a tool for sight. It's a canvas of identity, a focal point of connection. In a dark-haired, brown-eyed population, a pair of icy irises could seem mesmerizing, ethereal, perhaps even supernatural. It's no stretch to imagine how this could affect mating dynamics. Evolution doesn't rely solely on survival. It also runs on attraction, and attraction is anything but rational. If people started to associate blue eyes with uniqueness or allure, even subtly, the mutation had an edge. This is the magic of sexual selection, the concept that traits can flourish not because they help one survive, but because they help one get chosen. It's the same principle that explains why peacocks drag around their ludicrous tails, not helpful in a chase, but apparently irresistible at a bird bar. And the blue-eye gene, being recessive, played a long game. A person could carry the gene without showing it, passing it invisibly through generations until two carriers met and produced a child with that unmistakable light gaze. It's a patient mutation. A gambler. So as communities expanded slowly across the continent, little clusters of blue-eyed individuals began to form, especially in areas like Scandinavia and the Baltic, where genetic bottlenecks amplified the influence of chance. These populations were relatively isolated, small in number, and settled in harsh northern climates where eye colour conferred no serious disadvantage. In fact, the lower levels of melanin may have even helped by letting more light in during the dim winters, a possible evolutionary perk for navigating the long dark months. But it's important to remember, not all scientists agree on the advantage angle. Historians and geneticists still argue whether blue eyes were ever more than an aesthetic mutation. Was there truly an evolutionary benefit? Or was it just beauty bias wrapped in a genetic fluke? The debate continues. What we do know is that the mutation spread far and wide, and fast enough to surprise researchers. How fast? Let's take a step into the laboratory. In 2008, a Danish geneticist named Hans Eiberg and his team conducted a study mapping the HERK2 gene variant responsible for blue eyes. What they found was astonishing. Every blue-eyed person they tested, from Jordan to Denmark to Turkey, had the exact same genetic signature in that region. Identical markers. This didn't just hint at a common ancestor, it shouted it. That kind of genetic uniformity doesn't happen unless the mutation is relatively new and successful at spreading. Blue eyes, it turns out, are one massive family reunion in disguise. This discovery also offered a fun little paradox. Blue eyes are visually diverse, ranging from steely slate to electric turquoise, but genetically they're shockingly uniform, like different songs played on the same instrument. That's the magic of light scattering and the Tyndall effect, the same reason the sky looks blue. There's no blue pigment in the eye, none at all. The structure of the iris simply reflects and diffuses light in a way that appears blue. So every time you see someone with blue eyes, you're witnessing a trick of the light, biology's sleight of hand. Let's not overlook the timing. Around the same time that blue eyes began to blossom in Europe, humanity was experiencing one of its most radical transformations, the dawn of agriculture. Roughly 10,000 years ago, humans began to settle, cultivate, and domesticate. The Neolithic Revolution. This was a seismic shift. People stopped chasing animals and started corralling them. Forests were cleared, fields were tilled, and cities, tiny ones at first, began to sprout. With agriculture came grain, and with grain came beer, a surprisingly strong incentive for settling down. But it also brought something else: exponential population growth. Larger, denser communities meant more genetic mixing. Mutations that might have vanished in isolated groups now had a better chance of thriving. The blue-eye mutation, once a regional curiosity, could hitch rides on trade routes, marriage alliances, and migrating farmers. Suddenly, blue wasn't just for the cold north, it was headed south. But this expansion wasn't uniform. Brown eyes still held dominance globally, and they still do today. Despite the cultural obsession in some regions with blue or green eyes, more than 70% of the world's population remains brown-eyed. That figure climbs even higher when you look at regions close to the equator, where dark pigmentation is still the optimal defense against intense UV light. Yet the cultural weight of blue eyes was already beginning to take shape. In ancient Egypt, gods like Ra and Horus were often illustrated with dramatic, sometimes radiant eyes. Some fringe theorists have suggested these depictions may be symbolic references to rare, light-eyed individuals in Egyptian society, though mainstream historians are more cautious. Still, we know that by the time of the Mesopotamians, eye colour was beginning to take on symbolic meaning, light eyes denoting mystery, wisdom, or otherworldliness. And why not? In a mostly brown-eyed world, a blue gaze must have seemed like moonlight in a cave, something worth remembering, or perhaps even revering. Even today, stories persist that frame blue eyes as magical or prophetic. In some indigenous folklore, especially in cultures historically unfamiliar with the trait, light eyes were seen as signs of gods, spirits, or cursed lineage. Not always reverent, but always notable. As blue eyes spread through Europe, they encountered a rapidly shifting world. Bronze was on the rise, trade networks emerged, language groups splintered and multiplied. The Indo-European expansion was underway, its speakers sweeping westward across the continent and bringing new technologies, and possibly new genes, with them. Some archaeologists speculate that these migrating groups helped proliferate the blue-eye trait further west and north. Not by force, necessarily, but through settlement and assimilation. The early farmers and their bronze-wielding cousins didn't conquer with eyes alone, of course, but blue may have glimmered in their midst, and that glimmer would have lingered. By the time we reach the Bronze Age, ancient burial sites in Denmark and Germany begin to reveal individuals with light-coloured eyes and hair, confirmed through genetic testing. The shift is visible, literal, and irreversible. The mutation had gone from rarity to regionally common in just a few thousand years. A blink, really, in the evolutionary timeline. All of this from one change in one gene. It's almost poetic, that something so small could spread so wide, that a mutation with no clear function could end up shaping art, myth, romance, and identity. Blue eyes became an emblem, a filter through which history would gaze at itself. And yet, as recent as they are, blue eyes already carry the weight of lore. Stories of ice-eyed warriors in Norse sagas, kings and queens whose pale gazes became part of their legend. Lovers said to bewitch with nothing but a glance. The colour blue, once just a quirk of scattered light, became a symbol, first of rarity, then of beauty, then of something far harder to define. We don't need them to see, but somehow we can't stop seeing them. The snow crunches underfoot in the northern forests, each step of the small family group stirring the silence of the trees. They are moving again, nomads of the Mesolithic age, slipping between groves with spears and satchels, eyes always scanning the canopy for prey and predators alike. In this group, a child walks beside her mother, her gaze catching the fading afternoon light in a peculiar way. Her eyes are blue, startlingly so, and the others, even if they don't say it aloud, notice. This small girl, like others born across Europe during the slow-motion revolution of colour, carries the quiet evidence of mutation in her cells. But she doesn't know that. She only knows the wind feels cold today and that she's hungry again. As the genetic wave of blue-eyed individuals rolls through time, it becomes clear that their story isn't just a scientific curiosity. It's entangled with the very fabric of what it means to be human, to be seen. to stand out in a crowd, even if that crowd is only 12 people huddled around a smoky fire under an open sky. By the time the Bronze Age takes its hold and later the Iron Age stamps its mark across Europe and the Near East, blue eyes are no longer a brand new phenomenon, but they're still rare enough to inspire fascination. They become symbols of otherness, especially when they appear among groups where dark features dominate. This duality of attraction and suspicion threads its way through ancient accounts and oral histories, mingling biology with story, science with superstition. Take the ancient Greeks, for instance. They had no shortage of references to unusual eye colours. While most citizens of Athens and Sparta would have had dark features, their myths shimmered with pale-haired and light-eyed deities. Athena, goddess of wisdom, is famously described as glaucopis, a word usually translated as grey-eyed, but which might well imply a more luminescent or striking gaze, akin to modern blue or green hues. Artistic representations often gave her an arresting stare, wide and reflective, sharp as a blade. Some fringe historians argue that such descriptions were not purely symbolic, that they may have reflected encounters with foreign peoples who genuinely bore light features, possibly from the north. Greek colonies traded extensively with peoples from the Black Sea, Anatolia and beyond, areas where blue eyes had begun to concentrate. Whether or not this explains Athena's gaze, the imagery stuck. Meanwhile, the Romans had their own ideas about eye colour. To them, blue or grey eyes were oculi caesi, a term that, depending on the writer, could mean stormy, fierce or even eerie. Roman authors wrote with fascination, and sometimes distaste, about the pale-eyed Celts and Germans they encountered during military campaigns. Tacitus, in particular, described the Germanic tribes as having fierce blue eyes, emphasising their wildness and raw energy. It's worth noting that Roman society itself included many individuals with varied heritage. The empire stretched across territories where light-eyed populations were more common, including Gaul, Britannia, and parts of Eastern Europe. Over time, blue eyes were no longer strange. They were present in the forums, the bathhouses, and perhaps even in the Senate. Still, the eye retained its power as a symbol. In many cultures, a direct gaze was considered both bold and dangerous. The so-called evil eye superstition spanned from Mesopotamia to North Africa to Greece and beyond, and although most depictions of the evil eye don't specify colour, it's easy to imagine how a rare and unnerving stare, a cold, unblinking blue, could become an anchor for such fears. Even today, in parts of the Mediterranean, talismans to ward off the evil eye are often designed with concentric blue and white rings, an uncanny resemblance to the iris of a blue eye. Scholars debate whether these charms directly reference blue-eyed individuals, or if they simply adopted the aesthetic over time, but the link persists, layered with cultural memory. By the early medieval period, light eyes had become more concentrated in northern and eastern Europe. The Viking world, stretching from Scandinavia through the North Sea to parts of Russia and beyond, frequently showcased individuals with fair features, including pale eyes and hair. Historical DNA analysis of Viking remains reveals a surprising mixture of traits, suggesting they weren't all the tow-headed berserkers of modern fantasy, but light eyes were undeniably common. This gave rise to legends. The Norse gods, Odin with his one all-seeing eye, Thor with a gaze like a crack of lightning, were imagined in forms that echoed the people who worshipped them. Stories of seers and shield maidens with sky-coloured eyes filtered through the sagas, lending mystique and power to the trait. Even further east, in the lands of the Slavs and the steppe tribes, blue and grey eyes appeared among certain groups. As migration shifted, populations and cultural borders danced across maps. The gene flowed, sometimes flourishing, sometimes retreating. Historians still argue whether the movement of blue-eyed populations occurred primarily through conquest, trade, or simple wanderlust. Some maintain that massive migration events, such as the Indo-European dispersals, or later the Slavic expansions, played major roles. Others suggest smaller, cumulative exchanges between neighbours and neighbouring clans spread the trait more subtly. Meanwhile, in isolated regions like the mountain valleys of the Caucasus or the islands of the Baltic, genetic bottlenecks led to startling concentrations of light eyes and hair. These places, relatively untouched by waves of conquest, became living time capsules. In certain Estonian and Finnish villages, even today, over 90% of people have blue eyes. The gene didn't just survive there, it thrived. Interestingly, some of the first scientific studies on eye colour didn't emerge until much later, during the 18th and 19th centuries, when naturalists and early anthropologists began cataloguing human differences with a mixture of curiosity, arrogance, and misunderstanding. Eye colour became one of the many traits used to divide humans into types, a deeply flawed and often racist practice that would later be discredited, but which did contribute to the documentation of global eye colour distributions. During these years, eye colour charts and hereditary theories began to take shape. Scholars noticed that two brown-eyed parents could sometimes produce a blue-eyed child, but two blue-eyed parents never produced brown-eyed offspring. Mendel's pea experiments weren't far off, and soon, eye colour was being taught in classrooms as a textbook example of simple, dominant recessive inheritance. Of course, as genetics progressed, we realised it wasn't that simple. Eye colour involves at least 8 genes, with HERC2 and OCA2 playing the starring roles, but many others adding their own brushstrokes. It's a polygenic trait with nuances that resist tidy charts. That's why some blue-eyed parents can have children with green or grey eyes, because the orchestra of genes plays a more complex tune than once believed. Still, the basics remain. The mutation that created blue eyes limits melanin production in the iris, leading to the scattering of shorter wavelengths of light, making the eyes appear blue. And once that genetic switch was flipped, it kept flipping forward, generation after generation. Even today, scientists continue to discover subtleties. There are different types of blue: steel blue, cornflower blue, grey blue, even violet blue. They're all based on the same core mutation, but other genes, environmental factors, and the thickness of the iris structure can alter how the colour presents. That's why no two blue eyes are exactly alike, even if they share a common ancestor. Let's pause for a moment and picture that. Millions of people walking the earth today, all sharing a faint biological echo from a single human who lived thousands of years ago near the Black Sea. A person who would never know their legacy, who might have spent their days tending fires, gutting fish, watching birds, and yet in their cells a quiet revolution slept, waiting to open its eyes. It's a humbling thought. From a storytelling perspective, it's irresistible. The notion that a trait so intimate, so visible, and so evocative could link us across millennia. That the cold gaze of a Viking chieftain, the solemn stare of a Celtic druid, and the sleepy blink of a Swedish newborn might all shimmer with the same ancient code. In literature and art, blue eyes have long been wielded as symbols of otherness and desire. From Shakespeare's romantic heroines to the ice-eyed villains of modern cinema, this trait carries weight. It's been used to signal purity, danger, nobility, magic, even alienation, sometimes all at once. And then there's the ever-changing cultural lens. In some eras, blue eyes were celebrated. In others, they were mistrusted. The pendulum swings. Beauty trends shift. But the eyes themselves, those fragments of light and structure, remain unchanged, quietly reflecting the skies that watched over our earliest ancestors. In the next chapters of this story, as civilizations rise and fall, as empires trade silk and silver across continents, as warships cross oceans and explorers chart new maps, the gene travels with them, carried in bloodlines, forgotten in some places, reborn in others. Through it all, the blue eye persists, watching, remembering, waiting to be noticed. The sails of a longship catch the North Sea wind, groaning as timbers strain against the tide. The crew rows with synchronized grunts, their pale eyes squinting against the salt spray. It is the early medieval period, and the Viking Age is in full throttle. These seafaring Norsemen, tall, fair-haired, and often blue-eyed, are about to change the genetic landscape of Europe and beyond, whether they know it or not. As the prow slices through waves, it also slices into history, spreading not just violence and plunder, but genes, languages, and legends. These men, often portrayed in modern stories as stereotypically Nordic, were more genetically diverse than we like to think. Yet still, blue eyes show up disproportionately in Viking DNA, as modern genome studies confirm. These raids, migrations, and eventual settlements aren't just war stories. They're how blue eyes keep spreading. England, Ireland, Normandy, parts of Eastern Europe, all would receive their dose of Viking DNA, sometimes forcibly, sometimes through trade and marriage, sometimes through the complicated mix of conquest and assimilation that history excels at. Picture a small village in Northumbria, around the year 870. A Norse raider, now turned settler, has taken a local wife. Their children, playing barefoot in damp fields, carry new mixtures in their blood. One of them, perhaps, has the bright eyes of his father and the darker curls of his mother. He will grow up to be neither fully Saxon nor fully Norse, but something else altogether. A bridge, a blend. And in his irises the story of both cultures swirls, unnoticed. Historians still argue whether the blue-eyed trait was ever intentionally preserved, if people knowingly chose light-eyed mates to pass on the trait. Some argue that in tight-knit communities, where eyes were windows to health or purity, such details mattered. Others believe it was all incidental, a byproduct of proximity and timing. Either way, by the time the High Middle Ages arrive, the blue eye has made itself at home in many corners of Europe. Not dominant, never the majority trait, but present, like a flicker of winter light beneath a stormy sky. In medieval art and literature, eye colour isn't always described with precision, but when it is, blue or grey eyes often accompany either idealised heroes or mysterious outsiders. Think of chivalric romances, pale-eyed knights questing through dark forests, lady-loves, eyes like the summer sky. These weren't just embellishments, they mirrored the growing awareness that eye colour could differentiate, even enchant. And then, of course, religion gets involved. Medieval religious texts sometimes described saints or angels as possessing eyes, clear as glass, or radiant as the heavens. Whether metaphorical or literal, these descriptors began to encode a kind of celestial quality to light eyes. Not because God favoured one gene over another, but because people did. Humans love to assign meaning to the rare and beautiful, even if that meaning is invented. At the same time, blue eyes could also be ominous. In regions where they were uncommon, southern Europe, the Middle East, parts of North Africa, they could mark someone as foreign, or worse, unnatural. Folk tales from these areas sometimes linked pale eyes with shapeshifters, witches, or desert spirits. The gaze of the unfamiliar was unsettling. So, while in one village blue eyes might mean angelic grace, in another they might spark suspicion. Fast forward to the Crusades, a period of enormous cross-cultural contact. As European knights marched toward the Levant under banners of blood and belief, they encounter new climates, new foods, and new faces. And those faces often look back with dark eyes. These encounters weren't just battles, they were moments of curiosity, misunderstanding, attraction. Love stories, nightmares, everything, all at once. Imagine a Templar knight newly arrived in Jerusalem, surprised by how many stares he draws, not because of his armour, but because of his pale eyes. In the crowded souks, women glance his way, children whisper, some merchants smile and offer him figs, others avert their eyes. Over generations, with some crusaders staying and intermarrying, the gene pool swirls again. Blue eyes don't conquer, but they sneak into places they've never been. In the melting pot cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, it becomes possible, if still rare, for a child to be born with an unexpected glint in the iris, a reminder of ancestors from far away. Back in Europe, during the Renaissance, artists begin to explore human features with increasing realism, and in portraits of the wealthy and the powerful, we see more variety in eye colour than ever before. Not because eye colours themselves are changing faster, but because artists are finally paying attention to detail. The nuances of grey-blue, the sparkle of aquamarine, the near-translucent lightness of pale blue, all make their debut in oil and tempera. Leonardo da Vinci, ever the observer, even noted in his notebooks that light eyes reflected more light, and could appear to change colour depending on mood and light source. He wasn't wrong. The physics of a blue eye mean that it doesn't contain blue pigment, it simply reflects scattered light, like the sky, like deep water. In Renaissance Europe, blue eyes become increasingly associated with nobility and refinement. This is partly due to simple probability. Wealthier classes in Northern Europe were more likely to possess the gene, but also due to the blossoming of certain aesthetic ideals. Blondness and blue eyes as rare traits were prized in poetry and portraiture. They came to represent youth, beauty, and even spiritual clarity. But the pendulum swings. In parts of Italy and Spain, where dark eyes remain the norm, blue eyes might still be a curiosity or a threat. Folk tales there often give the blue-eyed stranger mysterious or even dangerous powers. A wandering witch, a love interest who brings chaos, a ghost with skylit eyes who appears in moonlight. These superstitions don't necessarily reflect malice, just distance. The more unusual a trait in a given area, the more lore builds around it. Sometimes flattering, often eerie. By the time the age of exploration kicks off and European ships begin to crawl across the globe like stubborn ants, blue eyes are once again on the move, this time in larger numbers. Soldiers, traders, missionaries, colonizers, many carry the gene to places where it never existed before, the Americas, the Caribbean, parts of Africa and Asia. And the reactions are mixed. In some native cultures, early contact included vivid memories of these pale-eyed invaders. Stories from the Aztec Empire, for instance, described Cortés and his men as godlike in their strange armour and pale features, though whether this was awe, fear, or clever diplomacy remains debated. Either way, their eye colour did not go unnoticed. As colonial empires grew, so too did the mixing of peoples. Children of European men and native women, sometimes through love, sometimes through violence, began to show new variations in appearance. Some had their mother's warm skin and their father's cold eyes. Others, a swirl of features that defied easy categorization. And once again, society tried to decide what those features meant. In some places, pale eyes became a mark of privilege, used to distinguish colonizers and their descendants from indigenous populations. In others, they became confusing, a mark of neither belonging nor exclusion, but something in between. A question with no easy answer. Historians still debate how much impact colonialism had on the spread of the blue-eye gene in non-European populations. Some say it was significant, particularly in regions where intermarriage or forced relations were common. Others argue that the trait remains rare in those populations, and that it's mostly remembered through art and story rather than biology. Yet the gene kept travelling. Even today, small populations in South America, Polynesia and southern Africa carry individuals with blue or light eyes, often the result of European ancestry long folded into local lineages. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the Enlightenment dawns. Science begins to peer more seriously into the body's mysteries. Eye colour becomes a subject of study, not just as a curiosity but as a potential clue to human variation. Phrenologists, for all their nonsense, still collect eye colour data. Artists refine their depictions of the gaze, and romantic writers like the Brontes or Mary Shelley can't help but imbue their characters with eyes like ice or storm clouds. By now, blue eyes are loaded, with meaning, with beauty, with suspicion. They are no longer just a genetic quirk, they're an aesthetic, a symbol, a narrative device. And with the rise of photography in the 19th century, they finally get captured. Not painted, not described, photographed, frozen in time. Pale irises staring back from grainy black and white portraits. Children in Victorian frocks, soldiers before the Great War. Women posed in stiff dignity, their eyes already haunted by things they haven't yet seen. There's something unnerving about those early photographs, isn't there? The way light blue eyes seem to shine white, as if the soul is closer to the surface than it should be, as if the camera sees too much. But the gaze endures. In every portrait, in every superstition, in every half-remembered story of a blue-eyed visitor from the north, this mutation, this tiny accident of DNA, keeps slipping forward through history. It doesn't ask to be noticed, but it is, again and again. And in the centuries to come, it will face even greater challenges. Industrialization, world wars, global migration, scientific scrutiny, ideological misuse. It will be used to separate and to seduce, to inspire, to categorize, to weaponize. But before all that, in this moment, in the quiet twilight of the early 1800s, blue eyes still belong mostly to individuals, to faces on daguerreotypes, to farmers watching the sky, to children skipping stones on glacial lakes, still personal, still soft, still watching. Steam hisses from brass valves, wheels clatter along iron tracks. The 19th century chugs forward on coal and invention. Factories rise like iron forests, and the world becomes faster, louder, and more interconnected than ever before. Yet, tucked inside all this mechanical chaos, something older and quieter continues. People still fall in love, have children, and pass along their genes, including that strange scattered flicker of ice blue in the eye. The Industrial Revolution isn't just a story of machines, it's a massive reshuffling of human life. Families that once lived in small villages for generations now flood into growing cities. People mix in ways they never had before. A boy from a sheep farming village in northern Scotland meets a girl from a coastal hamlet in Norway. Where do they meet? A factory in Manchester, maybe. Or a textile mill in Leeds. Their children, born between chimney soot and the hum of looms, inherit something more than poverty or resilience. They inherit genetic variance, a blend of ancestors who never would have met 200 years earlier, and tucked within their cells, the ever so slight odds that one of them will have bright blue eyes. Scientists begin to take note. Gregor Mendel is breeding peas and making charts, uncovering the basics of inheritance. Not many people read his work in his lifetime, but later others will realise he cracked open the vault. Eye colour, it turns out, doesn't just appear like magic. It follows rules, kind of. 2 brown-eyed parents can have a blue-eyed child, but the reverse is rare. Dominant and recessive alleles. Simple, except it's not. Even today, geneticists still argue whether the genetics of eye colour are fully understood. Once believed to be governed by a single gene, we now know multiple genes contribute to the shades we see. Deep brown, golden hazel, green, grey, steel blue, sky blue. It's not a binary, it's a gradient, a dance of light and pigment, 1,000 variables behind a single glance. But back in Victorian England, nobody knows that yet. They just know that people are moving more than ever, and that people look different depending on where you go. The British Empire spans the globe now, and within it, pale-eyed officials and soldiers are stationed in colonies far from home. In India, local artists sketch British administrators with careful detail. Buttoned-up uniforms, stiff postures, and yes, often strikingly pale eyes. In Australia, convicts and settlers alike bring their genes into contact with Aboriginal peoples. In Canada, French, Scottish and English traders intermarry with First Nations communities, producing Métis children whose features defy the strict racial categories their colonial overseers try to impose. Sometimes, these children are celebrated. Sometimes they're marginalised. Often, both. But always, they are living evidence of a truth that makes empires uncomfortable. People cannot be neatly sorted. In America, meanwhile, the population is booming. Immigration from Europe, especially from blue-eye-rich regions like Scandinavia, Germany and Ireland, floods cities like New York, Boston and Chicago. Tenement buildings are crammed with families. On Sundays, children with flaxen hair and wide blue eyes play stickball in alleys, their accents thick with neighbourhood slang, their heritage tangled in Ellis Island records. But the United States is also inventing something new, the pseudoscience of race hierarchies. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, social Darwinism and eugenics begin to poison the conversation around genes. Some scientists, white, powerful and deeply biased, start arguing that blue eyes, and the people who have them, are somehow superior. That light features reflect intelligence or moral purity. It's nonsense, of course, but it's effective nonsense, dangerous nonsense. Suddenly blue eyes aren't just a rare quirk, they're a symbol, a code, a way to decide who gets to belong and who doesn't. Entire immigration policies, especially in America and Australia, are shaped by this thinking. Countries begin to favour certain European populations over others, believing that certain stock is more desirable. If you're blue-eyed and fair, your chances of entry are better. If you're not, the gates narrow. It's around this time that passport photos and ID documentation become more standardised. Eye colour is listed as a physical descriptor, along with height and hair. Government forms begin to track something that people used to just notice casually. Suddenly your eyes are on paper, your phenotype archived, catalogued, ranked. But away from the policy debates and bureaucratic files, real people keep living messy, beautiful lives. In the tenement halls of New York's Lower East Side, a Jewish girl with dark curls and ocean blue eyes reads poetry by candlelight. She looks like her father, whose eyes glowed just the same back in Krakow before the pogroms. Down the hall, an Irish boy with the same blue eyes dreams of becoming a policeman like his older brother. They pass each other on the stairs every day, and someday, who knows? Maybe they'll fall in love, because ultimately eye colour is just one detail in the tapestry. Important, yes, fascinating for sure, but never the whole story. And then everything changes. The 20th century arrives like a bolt of lightning. 2 world wars, a Holocaust, revolutions, the collapse of empires, the dawn of television, and blue eyes, innocent little recessive things, become tangled in some of the darkest ideologies the world has ever known. In Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler and his cronies seize on Nordic imagery, to build their propaganda machine. The Aryan ideal, as they define it, includes tall stature, blonde hair, and crucially, blue eyes. Posters show smiling children with pale irises. Soldiers are evaluated by their appearance. Marriages are encouraged based on racial purity. Me. It's eugenics taken to its most horrific endpoint. And here's the twist. Hitler himself had brown eyes. So did many top Nazis. The whole construct was not just hateful, it was internally inconsistent. Scholars today still argue whether the obsession with blue eyes in Nazi propaganda was based on genuine belief or convenient myth-making. Likely, it was both. But propaganda doesn't need to be logical. It just needs to be memorable. And in that context, blue eyes became more than a trait. They became a weapon. A false standard used to justify extermination. Meanwhile, in the United States during the same period, blue eyes become a signifier in a different way. In the segregated South, under Jim Crow laws, the one-drop rule governed racial identity, and physical traits like eye colour were sometimes used to dispute someone's status. A black person with blue eyes might face extra scrutiny. A mixed-race child with pale skin and sky-coloured irises might pass in a world obsessed with dividing people into categories. Toni Morrison's novel, The Bluest Eye, would later capture this societal obsession with devastating clarity. In it, a young black girl wishes desperately for blue eyes, not because they're beautiful on their own, but because she believes they would make her lovable, seen, worthy. Think about that. A genetic trait, barely 10,000 years old, becomes tied to centuries of longing, rejection, power, and pain. Still, blue eyes endure. In Europe, after World War II, populations shuffle again. Refugees, prisoners, and survivors move across the continent. Borders shift, families scatter. In the bombed-out remains of Berlin or Warsaw, children grow up with no memory of the ideals that once weaponized their appearance. They just know their eyes are pale and their world is grey. In the United States, the baby boom begins. Blue eyes, while still more common among those of Northern European descent, begin to appear in more mixed families. Interracial marriages, still controversial and often illegal until the late 1960s, begin to slowly increase. And with them, the gene pool becomes richer, broader, deeper. In the 1970s and 80s, as globalization accelerates, blue eyes begin to show up in new contexts. In fashion and film, pale-eyed models and actors draw attention not just for their talent, but for their gaze. Paul Newman's eyes become legendary. Elizabeth Taylor, though her eyes were technically violet, stuns audiences with their clarity. Pop culture starts treating blue eyes as a kind of superpower, seductive, mysterious, unforgettable. But the pendulum swings again. By the 1990s and 2000s, blue eyes are no longer the dominant aesthetic. The world has become more diverse, and beauty standards expand. Dark eyes, once overshadowed, are now celebrated too. Brown is no longer boring. It's deep, rich, expressive. Green eyes gain their moment. The human gaze, in all its colours, is embraced. And science, once a tool of division, begins to redeem itself. Genetic testing explodes. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA offer ordinary people the chance to peek into their own genomes. And in the results, people start seeing things they never expected. Scandinavian ancestry where they thought they were Italian. A blue-eyed great-grandfather no one talked about. Surprise cousins, long-lost relatives. The ghost of a gene passed down through centuries. For many, the most surprising revelation is that blue eyes come from a single point of origin. A genetic mutation that occurred roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago near the Black Sea. One person, one moment, one cellular typo that caught on, and it makes people wonder, what did that person see? What sky did they look up to? What water reflected their face back to them? We'll never know, but that mutation, likely harmless at first, spread through generations like a ripple in still water. Not because it made people better, not because it meant anything, but because it survived. Carried by migrations, relationships, and random chance. A whisper from the past hiding in the eyes of the present. Today, only about 8 to 10% of the global population has blue eyes. It's rare, statistically speaking, but it's still here. Watching screens, reading books, waiting for coffee, staring out train windows, a reminder that even the tiniest quirks of our biology can echo across millennia, and it's not done travelling yet. A A child stands in front of a bathroom mirror, tilting their head, narrowing one eye, then the other. Why are my eyes blue, they wonder. It's not the first time someone has asked that question, and it certainly won't be the last. In fact, in homes, classrooms and clinics all around the world, people are asking that exact thing. But now, at last, science is catching up. By the early 21st century, genetic research enters a golden age. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, maps nearly all the genes in human DNA. Think of it like assembling a massive, intricate instruction manual for the body, and tucked somewhere deep inside in the chapters devoted to pigmentation and perception is a footnote about eye colour. For decades, researchers believed the OCA2 gene on chromosome 15 was the main switch for blue eyes. Turns out it's more like the circuit breaker for the entire building. The real key, at least for the specific blue-eyed mutation that kicked this whole story off, seems to lie nearby. A tiny change in the HERC2 gene, a sort of regulatory switch that affects the OCA2 gene's expression. In blue-eyed individuals, a single nucleotide change, the substitution of a base pair, reduces melanin production in the iris, resulting in the absence of brown pigment. No pigment. The blue isn't actually a colour at all, it's a trick of light. Scattering and reflection, the same way the sky looks blue despite having no actual pigment. So yes, the blue in your eyes is an illusion. Just like the sky, you're a walking, blinking magic show. But it's not just science for science's sake. As researchers study more genomes, they begin to trace migration patterns and ancestral movements based on these tiny differences. Eye colour becomes one of many markers, like footprints in the snow, pointing backward into prehistory. The blue-eyed mutation, it turns out, likely arose somewhere near the northwest shores of the Black Sea, in a region that's now modern-day Ukraine, Romania, or Bulgaria. Roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, give or take a few hundred generations, imagine the scene. A small, early agricultural society just beginning to settle down. The Neolithic era is in full swing. People are domesticating animals, planting wheat, building homes from clay and timber. And one child, just one, opens their eyes to a world not brown, but ice blue. It's not celebrated. It's not feared. It's just noted. Strange eyes, someone mutters in Proto-Indo-European, or whatever dialect was on the tongue that morning. Then they move on, because there are goats to milk and fires to stoke. But the child grows up. Perhaps they're considered lucky, or alluring, or perhaps they simply have more children, and those children inherit the mutation. Either way, the gene doesn't disappear, it travels. First, across the steppes of Europe, then into the heartlands, across rivers and over forests. Everywhere it goes, it rides the human story. Conquest, migration, marriage, famine, love. A gene doesn't care about borders, it only cares about replication. Fast forward to today, and you'll find blue eyes in the most unexpected places. Not just in Scandinavia, where over 80% of people still carry them, but in rural Argentina, in a village in northern Iran, in the Australian outback. Some of these appearances are due to colonial history, legacies of British or European settlement, but others. They're reminders that human history is complex, twisted, and full of surprises. Consider the village of Malana in India's Himachal Pradesh region. Tucked away in the Himalayas, its residents speak an ancient dialect and have long claimed descent from Alexander the Great's soldiers, and indeed some among them have pale skin and light eyes. Scientists debate this claim. Maybe it's true, maybe it's just a convenient legend. But the blue eyes, they're very real. Or take the Solomon Islands, where some indigenous people have dark skin and naturally blonde hair. No European ancestry required, just an independent mutation. It throws assumptions out the window. The world doesn't always conform to neat little categories, which is a good time to ask. Why did blue eyes survive in the first place? After all, natural selection typically favours traits that are useful for survival, and blue eyes, being light-sensitive, are not exactly ideal in blazing sun. In tropical regions, brown eyes dominate. More melanin means better protection from UV rays. So why didn't the blue-eyed gene disappear? One hypothesis: sexual selection. It's the classic peacock tail theory. Some traits survive not because they help you live longer, but because they help you attract mates. Perhaps in ancient Europe, where winters were long and daylight was scarce, pale eyes became a novelty, a sign of uniqueness, and in a small population, novelty can go a long way. researchers have speculated that men or women with blue eyes might have been seen as more desirable, and thus more likely to reproduce. Of course, no one knows for sure. Historians and biologists still argue whether sexual selection alone can explain the rapid spread of blue eyes in such a short evolutionary window, but it's a compelling idea that the shimmer of a gaze could shape an entire continent's genetic future. And while we're here, fun fact time. In one Finnish study, researchers found that people with blue eyes tend to be more sensitive to light, but also more likely to enjoy sunny weather. Go figure. Another quirky tidbit? Some studies suggest blue-eyed people may have slightly higher alcohol tolerance. Is it biological or cultural? Still up for debate. But either way, probably not something to test on a weekday. Back in the world of pop culture, blue eyes continue to enchant. In cinema, they become a visual shorthand for mystery, magic, or intensity. Think Frodo Baggins, whose piercing gaze is meant to convey innocence and destiny. Or Daenerys Targaryen, with her platinum hair and icy stare. In genre fiction, blue eyes often signal power, sometimes literally, as with glowing-eyed mutants or mind-controlling characters. It's a trope now baked into storytelling, though it has roots stretching back to ancient myths. The Norse gods, after all, were often described with pale eyes. Odin, the all-seeing wanderer. Freya, the beauty and battle goddess. Even the Greeks got in on it. Aphrodite, in some retellings, had blue eyes as brilliant as the sea. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe people have always assigned meaning to what stands out. But in the 21st century, we're starting to see that meaning shift. For years, blue eyes were treated as a beauty standard in Western culture. Now, that standard is being challenged and expanded. Social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram are awash in people flaunting every shade imaginable. Heterochromia, where one eye is a different colour than the other, has become a badge of uniqueness. Brown eyes with golden flecks, captivating. Green eyes with hazel swirls, mesmerising. The world is getting more mixed. Interracial marriages are at an all-time high in many countries. The result? Children born today often have a wider palette of features than ever before, and that's making blue eyes rarer. In the United States, for instance, the percentage of people with blue eyes has dropped significantly over the last century, from around 50% in the 1900s to under 20% today. But rarity isn't loss, it's evolution. Blue eyes aren't disappearing, they're blending, shifting, hiding in recessive pockets, waiting to emerge again, sometimes skipping generations, sometimes returning where you least expect them, and they're inspiring curiosity. Millions of people now send saliva to labs to learn their ancestry. They want to know where their blue eyes came from, whether it was a great-grandparent from Norway, or a merchant ancestor who married into a Baltic family, or maybe, just maybe, a forgotten traveller whose descendants wandered far from the Black Sea. Of course, those DNA reports don't always bring clarity. Sometimes they bring more questions. How can I be 8% Finnish? Why did no one mention we had Balkan ancestry? Wait, are we related to that person in Idaho? The past isn't a straight line. It's a tangled web, full of forks, loops and dead ends. And in the middle of it all, eyes keep watching. They've watched wars, watched lovers, watched births and funerals, watched stars spin across the sky. Blue eyes especially are like mirrors to memory, pale enough to reflect, strange enough to wonder about. They are quite literally windows to biology, to history, to possibility. And just imagine, if you had blue eyes 5,000 years ago, you might have been the only one in your village. If you have them now, you're still part of a small club, one tied not by country or creed or class, but by one elegant accident of genetics, an accident that refuses to fade. The human eye, small, wet, and only slightly larger than a gumball, is a ridiculously dramatic piece of machinery. Beneath that shiny cornea and soft iris lies a universe of precision, all working to bring the world into focus. But tonight, we're not looking at eyes just as tools. We're gazing through them as stories. Because blue eyes aren't only a biological quirk, they're cultural currency. Woven into language, law, superstition and status, they've stared down monarchs, bewitched poets, and survived genocide. Let's begin with a tale from the ancient world. In Homer's epics, the goddess Athena is often called Glaucopis, typically translated as bright-eyed or owl-eyed, but some scholars argue the root implies blue-grey eyes. Either way, her gaze is luminous, perceptive, even threatening. In myths, eyes are never passive. They pierce, search, haunt. Blue eyes, with their pale glow and watery shimmer, get a special kind of mystical treatment. It continues through history. In ancient Egypt, most people had dark eyes and hair, understandably given the sun. But blue eyes appear in art, painted on statues, or depicted in precious stones set into the lids of idols. Notably, some busts from the Old Kingdom feature inlaid eyes made of white alabaster with lapis lazuli irises. Blue wasn't common, but it was divine. The Eye of Horus, a symbol of protection and healing, is sometimes associated with the sky and stars. Whether symbolic or literal, the presence of blue evokes something not just rare, but powerful. Then we move to the Romans, who, as usual, have opinions about everything. In Roman poetry, blonde hair and blue eyes often symbolise Germanic tribes. The poet Tacitus described the Germanic people as blue-eyed and fiery-haired, viewing them with a mix of admiration and suspicion. Romans considered such features exotic, sometimes barbaric, sometimes beautiful. That tension never really goes away. During the Middle Ages, blue eyes take on another layer of meaning. In Christian iconography, the Virgin Mary is frequently depicted with blue eyes, despite having been Middle Eastern. Chalk it up to medieval European artists painting what they saw in their own world. Or perhaps it was aspirational, a way to reflect ideals of purity and sanctity through pale, luminous features. Blue eyes become linked to innocence, even sanctity. Of course, there's also a fair bit of misrepresentation going on. Meanwhile, across Europe, folklore is blooming. In parts of Ireland and Scotland, people with blue eyes are sometimes called fey-touched. In Slavic traditions, blue eyes are said to reflect the winter, cold, beautiful, unpredictable. Old superstitions warned that people with blue eyes could see into the other world. One Romanian folktale even tells of a village girl whose blue eyes cursed any man who looked into them with desire. Dramatic? Absolutely, but also deeply telling. Deeply, blue eyes were unusual enough to inspire fear or fascination or both. Not all of this is harmless fantasy. In some cultures, especially where blue eyes were extremely rare, they became targets. The belief in the evil eye spans cultures from Turkey to Tunisia. A blue eye, especially one with a piercing or unnatural look, was thought to carry magical curses. Amulets shaped like blue eyes were, and still are, worn to ward off misfortune. Ironically, these talismans used blue as a form of protection against blue. But superstition is just the beginning. Enter the Renaissance, where beauty becomes a subject of art and science. In Europe, pale skin, light hair and blue eyes become associated with upper-class delicacy. Portraits of aristocrats often idealise these traits, even when the real person might have looked nothing like that. In this era, blue eyes become part of an aesthetic ideal, linked to refinement, nobility, even God's chosen. It's all a bit theatrical, really. And in the 19th century, things take a darker turn. Pseudoscientific fields like phrenology and physiognomy, now thoroughly debunked, claim to interpret character from appearance. Writers and scholars start making alarming declarations. Blue-eyed people are noble and rational. Dark-eyed people are passionate and impulsive. None of it's true, of course, but it lays the groundwork for even worse ideologies. Because as the 20th century dawns, eye colour becomes political. The Nazis, infamously, adopt the image of the blue-eyed, blonde-haired Aryan as their racial ideal. It's a grotesque distortion, built on eugenics and nationalist fantasy. In their propaganda, the pure German look is idolised. Children with blue eyes are placed on posters. Schools are instructed to track such features. Those who don't fit the mould, marginalised, demonised, exterminated. In one chilling twist, the Nazi regime even performed experiments on prisoners with blue eyes, trying to study pigmentation genes or replicate the feature through chemical drops. Science, in the wrong hands, becomes monstrous. The very mutation that began as a random, innocent flicker of evolution becomes weaponized as a tool for oppression. After the war, the pendulum swings back, but not entirely. The blue-eyed ideal lingers in fashion, film, and advertising. In post-war America, blue-eyed celebrities dominate the silver screen. Think Paul Newman, whose ice blue stare became iconic, or Elizabeth Taylor, whose rare violet blue eyes added an aura of otherworldliness. And then there's Frank Sinatra, nicknamed Old Blue Eyes, as if his gaze itself was a brand. Blue eyes sell, in magazines, in perfume ads, on runways. They're still shorthand for allure, mystery, even danger. But slowly, the narrative begins to change. By the late 20th and early 21st century, beauty standards begin to diversify. Magazines start featuring more models with dark eyes, mixed heritage, and non-European features. Still, there's a strange tension. Many people with dark eyes are told blue eyes are better. Contact lenses flood the market. Social media filters let users test drive a pair of pale peepers. Some influencers even fly overseas for iris implant surgeries. Risky, expensive, and largely unnecessary. But culture is catching up to reality. More people are embracing their natural features, celebrating brown, green, hazel, grey, and everything in between. The blue-eyed standard is being nudged off its pedestal. And here's the wild part. Science agrees. There is no evidence that blue eyes are superior for vision, intelligence, or temperament. In fact, light eyes are more prone to certain conditions like photophobia and macular degeneration. Brown eyes tend to offer better protection from the sun. Every eye colour has its trade-offs, its strengths and quirks. Let's not forget the fringe stuff, though, because what's a bedtime story without a few weird detours? There's a persistent urban legend that people with blue eyes can see better in the dark. Is it true? Kinda, but not dramatically so. Because blue eyes allow more light to pass through, some argue that night vision is slightly improved, but the difference is minimal, more noticeable in extreme low-light conditions like stargazing in the Arctic, not reading a novel by candlelight. And here's a juicy one. Some ancient alien theorists, yes, those guys, claim that blue eyes are the result of extraterrestrial genetic interference. That's right, aliens tinkering with early humans to create a subspecies marked by light eyes. Their evidence? Well, let's just say it's more History Channel at 2 a.m. than peer-reviewed journal, but it's a popular theory in fringe circles. Honestly, if you can believe a planet-sized spacecraft is hiding behind the moon, then blue eyes as cosmic breadcrumbs probably doesn't sound that far-fetched. In the world of psychics and aura readers, blue eyes are often said to correlate with air personalities. Think thinkers, dreamers, intuitives. People who live in their heads. Again, not backed by science, but the mythology sticks. Still, for all the fluff and fiction, there's a grounded truth running through it. Blue eyes are powerful because they're rare and because they travel with a story of mutation and migration, of myth and manipulation, a story still being written. Every time a baby opens their eyes and reveals that soft shimmer of pale, impossible blue, and sometimes blue eyes show up where they weren't expected. A couple with brown eyes has a blue-eyed child, and suddenly the family tree gets a bit more interesting. Recessive gene, the doctor says casually, but for many parents it feels like a surprise gift, a living fossil, a reminder that the past never really leaves us. It just waits, curled up in chromosomes for its cue. Even pop culture is moving with the times. Superheroes now come in every shade and background. The blue-eyed saviour trope still exists, sure, but it's being balanced by stories from other perspectives. That's progress. Imperfect, overdue, but real. And in one of the strangest full-circle moments, some people today are editing their eye colour, not through surgery or filters, but through biohacking. Experimental tech now exists that can use lasers to break down melanin in the iris, permanently changing brown eyes to blue. Is it safe? Not really. Is it regulated? Not yet. But it's happening. People once again are chasing blue. Why? Maybe it's the rarity, maybe it's vanity, or maybe it's just human nature to chase what we can't have. But here's the secret. Blue eyes aren't magic. They're not better, brighter, or more enlightened. They're just different. A quirk of light and melanin. A genetic echo from a Neolithic child born near the Black Sea. That's what makes them special. Not because they mean more, but because they mean something. A story, a question, a glimmer. And tonight, as another child stands before a mirror and blinks at their reflection, they may ask the same thing people have asked for generations. Why are my eyes this colour? And if they listen closely, not just with ears but with imagination, they might hear an answer from 10,000 years ago. The world turns, ages pass, and yet blue eyes keep showing up like stubborn secrets. And not just in Europe, mind you. They wink out from faces on distant islands tucked into gene pools like stowaways, relics of ancient mixing. So tonight, we're following those unexpected flashes of blue, how they migrate, mingle, and resurface in the most unlikely places. Picture a freckled child in a dusty Peruvian village, wide-eyed and blue-stared, puzzling everyone at the market. Her parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, all brown-eyed. No recent European ancestry. Yet there they are, those eyes, catching the light like mirrors of the sky. She's not alone. Across the globe, small populations carry the pale-eyed trait like a quiet echo of ancient travels. These rare pockets aren't mistakes. They're clues, genetic breadcrumbs left behind by migrating humans, wandering traders, stranded sailors, lost empires. Some of the world's most remote populations have preserved blue eyes through the stubborn magic of recessive inheritance, and sometimes sheer luck. In Afghanistan, the Nuristani people, isolated in the Hindu Kush mountains, show a surprising frequency of blue and green eyes. Researchers are still debating whether this comes from ancient Indo-European migrations or more recent admixture with European invaders. The gene may have slipped in quietly generations ago and nestled itself into the population like a secret waiting for a spark. And then there's the Kalash of northern Pakistan, whose legends say they descended from Alexander the Great's armies. With their pale eyes and lighter features, they've long been the subject of both fascination and controversy. Genetic studies haven't definitively linked them to Macedonian soldiers, but their unique look, and the stories attached to it, make them walking historical riddles. Further west, you get the Berbers of North Africa. Scattered across Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia, many have light eyes and fair skin, especially in mountainous or coastal areas. Were these traits brought in during Roman occupation, Phoenician trade, or are they simply remnants of an older pre-Arab genetic tapestry? Historians still argue whether North Africa was more genetically diverse in antiquity than it is today. The answer, predictably, depends on which bones you dig up. Hop on a boat to the Solomon Islands and the surprises continue. The Melanesian people, famous for their dark skin and startling blue eyes, defy easy explanation. For a long time, scientists assumed the trait came from European colonizers, but nope. Genetic research from the early 2000s revealed a separate mutation on the TIA1 gene, totally independent from the one responsible for blue eyes in Europeans. This means that two completely unrelated human populations developed blue eyes via different genetic paths, a case of convergent evolution. Like nature hit the same note twice, on different instruments. So while most blue-eyed people today descend from that single Neolithic ancestor near the Black Sea, they're not alone in the Pale Gaze Club. Different stories, same shimmer. It's a good reminder. Humans are weirdly good at remixing the same melodies across different eras, and it's not just about DNA. Language carries the legacy too. Some of the world's oldest words for blue didn't even exist until relatively recently. In Homer's Odyssey, for instance, the sea is described as wine dark, rather than blue. Some scholars argue that early cultures may not have differentiated blue from green. Ancient Hebrew texts often lumped blue and green under the same word, and in Old Japanese, Ao once referred to both blue skies and leafy greens. Only later did these distinctions sharpen, mirroring shifts in perception and social value. So blue eyes aren't just an old trait, they're also a modern invention, culturally speaking. We learn to notice them, name them, and eventually chase them. Language created a frame around the phenomenon, turning a fluke of melanin into a symbol, of status, of beauty, of otherness, and with symbols come stories. Take the Maori of New Zealand. Traditionally, blue eyes were not considered a sign of beauty or luck. In fact, some tribes viewed them with suspicion, an omen even. Some oral histories tell of children born with pale eyes who were believed to be touched by ancestral spirits. Others suggest they were the offspring of ghosts or forest dwellers. Blue eyes, in those tales, weren't human at all, they were from somewhere else. In Icelandic sagas, eye colour is frequently mentioned as a marker of nobility or supernatural ability. A warrior might be described as having eyes like ice, and that wasn't just poetic flair, it was a sign. Beware, he sees more than you think. In Russia, some folk tales claim that witches, vedmi, can change their eye colour at will. Blue is said to be their default. Cool, calculating, unnerving. Something about the unnatural glow. Even in the coldest winters, blue eyes don't warm. They're untrusting. or perhaps just unreadable. Meanwhile, in parts of West Africa, eye colour anomalies were often seen as omens, for better or worse. A child born with pale eyes might be destined for spiritual leadership, or feared as cursed. It all depended on the interpretation, the story you wanted to believe. And that's the thing, every culture has one. Whether it's divine favour, supernatural danger, or ancestral inheritance, blue eyes mean something. They're never neutral. Sometimes the stories become more than just stories. They become systems. In colonial Latin America, for instance, Spanish elites meticulously tracked ancestry through a racial classification system called the casta. Lighter eyes, along with pale skin, became signs of higher social rank. It wasn't just aesthetics, it was politics. Blue eyes, in this warped hierarchy, became currency, even when inherited from someone the record keepers preferred to forget. The echoes linger in modern beauty standards. In places where blue eyes are rare, South Asia, East Asia, Africa, there's still a thriving market for coloured contact lenses. Some wearers do it for fun, some for fashion, some because they've been told it's more attractive. The global beauty industry, ever quick to capitalise on insecurity, sells the dream in plastic discs and airbrushed ads. But it's not all manipulation. Sometimes blue eyes become a bridge, a shared curiosity. In places like Brazil, where mixed ancestry is the norm, unexpected eye colours pop up like surprise guests at a family reunion. Someone's grandmother had them, or an uncle, or a great-great-great-grandparent whose name no one remembers, but whose gaze lives on in family photos, faded but unmistakably blue. In these moments, blue eyes aren't exotic or elite. They're nostalgic, proof of connection, of unexpected roots. It's the same quiet thrill as discovering a long-lost relative in a faded archive. Genetics made visible, and blue eyes have long played cameo roles in the histories of conquest and rebellion. In colonial India, Anglo-Indians, children of British and Indian parents, sometimes had pale eyes and faced discrimination from both sides. Not British enough for the crown, not Indian enough for the locals. Their eyes became markers of liminality, neither here nor there. In the American South, the legacy of European-African admixture sometimes manifests in light eyes among black communities. These features, inherited across generations, tell silent stories of resilience, coercion, and survival. They complicate the tidy racial binaries imposed by past centuries. One gaze can carry centuries of contradiction. Even within modern genetics, the presence of blue eyes where they shouldn't be forces scientists to keep revisiting assumptions. Every time someone's 23andMe report spits out an unexpected percentage of Northern European ancestry, questions bloom. Family legends are re-examined, and sometimes long-ignored truths finally get a voice. But for all this swirling history, the science remains elegant. Blue eyes, remember, are just a lack of pigment, a trick of scattering light, like the sky or the ocean, and yet they carry disproportionate meaning. Because we gave it to them. We wrapped them in mythology, layered them with language, painted them into portraits and propaganda. We made them matter. In a way, eye colour is one of the last holdouts of visible genetics. Most traits, like blood type, mitochondrial DNA, or immune system complexity, live quietly inside us, invisible to casual glance. But eyes? They speak. You meet someone, and before a single word is exchanged, you've clocked their eye colour. It's one of the first things a baby learns to lock onto. It becomes, in our minds, a personality trait. Hazel-eyed and sarcastic, blue-eyed and dreamy, dark-eyed and intense. We assign character to colour, and though we know, rationally, that it's not true, we still fall for it. Tonight, maybe we can forgive ourselves that. Because behind every blue gaze is a story, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, always evolving. That little girl in Peru, maybe her eyes skip a generation. Or maybe they came from a stranger riding the Andes centuries ago, a sailor blown off course, a priest with stories from Castile. She'll never know for sure, but that doesn't make the story less real. It just makes it more human, just like blue eyes themselves, fragile, recessive, unreasonably persistent. A mutation that became a movement, a flash of change that rewrote faces across continents, and still the world turns, eyes open, stories begin again. Somewhere in the icy blue hush of a Scandinavian forest, a child is born with eyes that mirror the frozen lakes. The year is 1732, but it could just as easily be 2002 or 1200 BCE. The story repeats, generation after generation, those same pale irises peering out from behind heavy lashes, absorbing more than they reveal. But behind the quiet gleam of those blue eyes, something stranger is happening. Not just biology, not just history, culture now, churning, shaping, and ultimately claiming the gaze for itself. Because here's where the narrative takes a sharp, dazzling turn. Blue eyes aren't just rare, they're coveted. Not everywhere, not all at once, but steadily, insidiously, across centuries and continents. They shift from novelty to symbol, from accident to aspiration, and like all symbols, they carry baggage. Take Victorian England, where romantic poets wax lyrical about cerulean eyes like they're portals to the soul. Her eyes were the blue of forget-me-nots, they'd write, not bothering to explain why that mattered. It just did. Something about fragility, virtue, innocence, all conveniently projected onto pale-eyed women sitting quietly in overstuffed parlours. In 1847, Charlotte Brontë publishes Jane Eyre, a novel that practically kneels at the altar of modest blue-eyed virtue. Jane, plain but resilient, is praised for her clear blue gaze, a window, we're told, into her moral integrity, and her rival, Blanche Ingram, with her dark and fiery eyes, is dismissed as vain, manipulative. Coincidence? Of course not. This was Victorian England, where eye colour doubled as a character trait. Lighter meant purer, darker meant complicated. It's a literary trope that travels well. In American fiction, especially early 20th century romance and coming-of-age tales, blue eyes become shorthand for decency, goodness and trustworthiness. Think Little Women, Anne of Green Gables, The Great Gatsby. Even Superman, the Man of Steel himself, is drawn with piercing blue eyes, a literal beacon of all American morality, truth, justice, and the kind of gaze you can trust to walk your dog. Meanwhile, in Germany during the early 20th century, this same visual shorthand takes a darker turn. The blue-eyed, blonde-haired ideal becomes a political weapon, a racial standard wielded with terrifying consequences. Under Nazi ideology, the so-called Aryan look becomes both aspiration and ammunition. Entire lives are judged based on physical appearance. And blue eyes? They shift from literary charm to deadly metric. People forget how bizarrely bureaucratic this obsession became. In Nazi-run schools, children underwent eye examinations, not just for vision, but for colour classification. Scientists studied irises like maps. Officials flipped through anthropological charts. One shade too dark, and your fate could change. The T4 euthanasia program, the Lebensborn breeding project, these weren't just fueled by racism, they were propelled by aesthetics, by myths repackaged as science. Historians still argue whether the Aryan ideal was based more on selective breeding propaganda or sincere belief. Either way, blue eyes were no longer just symbolic, they were strategic, and that should give anyone pause. A genetic quirk from the Black Sea suddenly at the heart of state-sanctioned horror. That's the danger of symbols. They change masks so easily. Post-World War II, the world shudders. The worst parts of racial pseudoscience are denounced, discredited. But the preferences linger, quietly, like ghosts. In Hollywood's golden age, blue-eyed actors reigned supreme. Paul Newman, Grace Kelly, Elizabeth Taylor, whose eyes straddle the line between blue and violet, which frankly seems unfair to the rest of us. Directors favour close-ups of pale irises catching the light. Cinematographers light scenes to emphasise that shimmer. Audiences are trained. Blue eyes equals captivating. By the 1980s, the tide has shifted again. Blue eyes are no longer moral indicators. They're exotic, sultry, edgy. In advertising, they become a focal point, an aesthetic flex. Ever notice how perfume ads love slow-motion shots of eyes in grayscale? There's a reason. Eyes are the story, and blue ones, doubly so. Then comes the 1990s and early 2000s, when colour contact lenses explode in popularity. Suddenly, you don't need genes, you just need access. From Bollywood to Seoul, Lagos to Sao Paulo, beauty influencers experiment with iris colour like it's lipstick. Whole subcultures form around altering eye colour for cosplay, fashion or sheer curiosity. Some wear them daily, some save them for photo shoots. Others just want to see how the world reacts differently when their eyes say sky instead of soil. In some cases the change is subtle, a little hazel-leaning blue, a greyish green. In others, it's dramatic, bright aqua, icy steel, full sci-fi. These lenses are often marketed using European names: Norwegian glacier, Siberian ice, Irish mist. The suggestion isn't subtle. This isn't just a new look, it's a new identity. But while some embrace it, others push back. Critics point out that this fetishizing of light eyes is rooted in colonialism, colorism, and centuries of Eurocentric beauty standards. They're not wrong. Look closer at the ads, and you'll notice a pattern. Blue eyes are always framed as aspirational, while darker features are either exoticized or ignored. The debate rages on, in beauty circles, in sociology textbooks, in the comment sections of makeup tutorials. Some people say changing your eye colour is self-expression. Others call it self-erasure. As usual, the truth is messier, and probably sits somewhere in between. And then there are the people who go further, not just contacts, surgery. In the last 2 decades, companies in the US, India and Mexico have begun offering permanent iris implant procedures, often marketed as eye colour change surgeries. Risks include vision loss, inflammation and long-term damage. Still, demand persists. A few minutes under the laser and your dark brown eyes are gone, replaced by a permanent light hue. Is it worth it? Depends on whom you ask. For some, it's liberation. For others, it's trauma disguised as transformation. Meanwhile, those born with blue eyes are often unaware of the historical weight behind them. It's just how they look. They didn't ask for the symbolism, but they carry it anyway. Strangers comment on their eyes more often. Friends remember them because of their ice blue stare. Teachers notice them across a crowded classroom. And yes, the science remains constant. Blue eyes are a recessive trait. If both your parents have them, you almost certainly will too. If only one does, the odds dip. But occasionally a brown-eyed couple will produce a blue-eyed child thanks to hidden carriers generations back. That's how recessives work, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right match. In one famous case from the 2000s, a Nigerian-British couple, both with dark skin and brown eyes, had a blue-eyed daughter. The media swarmed. Headlines screamed about miracles, but scientists shrugged. Genetics, they said. Recessive traits, mixed ancestry, and a dash of randomness. Not a miracle. Just a reminder that genes don't always follow expectations. The child's parents, though, weren't interested in debates. They were busy answering strangers' questions, fielding sceptical stares, protecting their daughter from being treated like a curiosity. For them, blue eyes weren't a mystery or a marvel. They were just their daughter's eyes. And that's the tension, isn't it? Between the ordinary and the mythic, between the science and the story. Because blue eyes are just pigment, or rather the absence of it. But they're also 1,000 stories stitched into one gaze. Stories of conquest and curiosity, of love and loss, of being seen and being stared at. Even now, in the age of genetic testing and ancestry apps, people are still surprised by blue eyes. A child is born and everyone coos, "Oh, look at those eyes," like they're rare coins or 4-leaf clovers. Sometimes they fade to green or grey by toddlerhood. Sometimes they stay, but they're always noticed, and they always get remembered. So, here we are. A trait born from a single mutation, possibly in one lonely hunter's child, maybe near the Black Sea, around 10,000 years ago. That spark travelled far. It crossed ice and ocean. It flickered through empires. It survived genocide, fashion cycles, poetry, pseudoscience and TikTok filters. It hid in genes. It shouted in art. It whispered in lullabies. And now it stares back from mirrors in every part of the world, in cities and villages, in places where it once didn't exist. Not because of magic, but because of us, humans, tirelessly mixing, migrating, falling in love, making families, repeating the great messy experiment of existence. Blue eyes, once a flicker, now a chorus. As the 21st century hums into high gear, the world finds itself knee-deep in DNA kits, ancestry reports, and hyper-personalised genetic services that promise to unlock the secrets of you. Suddenly, blue eyes aren't just an aesthetic preference or a quirky family trait, they're a data point. A mutation on chromosome 15, a code whispering across time, spit into a tube, and 2 weeks later, you get a digital scroll that tells you you're 11% Scandinavian, 6% Balkan, and oh yes, you probably carry the OCA2 gene variant associated with blue eyes. Science fiction? Not anymore. People read their reports with fascination. That explains it, they say, staring at their reflection like it's been slightly rewritten. A feature that once felt random now feels historic, tethered, like their eyes carry some forgotten invitation to an ancient lineage. But what happens when everyone starts seeing their genes in percentages? When something as personal as eye colour is sliced into probability charts and origin maps? For some, it's thrilling. A high-tech ancestry treasure hunt. For others, it's unsettling, like their identity has been reduced to a cocktail of nucleotides. And then there are those who receive unexpected results. The family myths that collapse under scrutiny. A woman in Iowa learns her supposedly pure Irish ancestry includes a solid chunk of Greek and North African DNA. A man in rural Hungary discovers his grandfather wasn't exactly who the family thought. And tucked inside those surprises are often clues about why someone's baby has those bright blue eyes, despite generations of brown. Historians still argue whether the surge in consumer genetics will lead to a better understanding of population migration, or simply reinforce personal biases. What's clear is this. Blue eyes are no longer just visible in faces, they're traceable in code. And with that comes a whole new chapter of curiosity and confusion. The implications spiral quickly. Law enforcement starts using genetic genealogy to crack cold cases, matching DNA from crime scenes to public ancestry databases. That blue-eyed uncle twice removed, he might help solve a decades-old mystery. Meanwhile, ethicists raise alarms about privacy, consent, and the weirdly dystopian direction things are headed. But while privacy experts shout into voids, the public keeps uploading, sharing, zooming in on haplogroups and migration routes, and what their great-great-great-grandparents were probably eating when blue eyes first flickered to life. People discover that much of Europe once hosted exclusively brown-eyed populations, that the sudden rise of blue eyes may have been tied to social selection as much as climate. Some scientists suggest that in early agricultural societies, lighter features stood out, creating an unconscious preference for novelty. In other words, the first blue-eyed individuals may have been considered exotic, desirable, rare. Imagine a Neolithic village where everyone has deep brown eyes, except for one child with eyes the colour of morning mist. Do people whisper? Do they stare? Do they invent stories? Probably. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and when we find a break in the pattern, we don't just observe it, we mythologize it. And so blue eyes became stories. As modern tech zooms in on the mechanics of it all, there's a simultaneous zoom out in culture. Blue eyes once again become part of a broader visual aesthetic, a feature enhanced, manipulated or mimicked with digital ease. Photoshop, Instagram filters, AI-generated avatars. The blue eye is no longer a biological rarity. It's an option on a drop-down menu. Virtual influencers, entirely computer-generated, are created with flawless icy irises, chosen not for genetics but for brand impact. Engagement rates go up with lighter eyes, marketers say behind the scenes. And so the algorithmic beauty standard is coded, blue pixel by blue pixel. But outside the filtered world of screens, people still carry their eyes through daily life, facing reactions that are sometimes awe, sometimes suspicion. In parts of the Middle East, Africa, or East Asia, blue eyes on a local child spark questions, assumptions, even accusations. Teachers ask about parentage, neighbours speculate. It can be isolating, even for a feature considered beautiful. In Turkey, for instance, there's a deep-rooted superstition about blue eyes. The nazer, an amulet shaped like an eye, typically blue and white, is worn to protect against the evil eye. And who's thought to give the evil eye most often? Historically, those with blue eyes. They were seen as piercing, unnatural, capable of casting bad luck with a glance. In rural areas, even today, blue-eyed babies are sometimes given extra protection, as if their gaze might accidentally curse someone or attract too much attention. It's ironic, isn't it? A trait prized in Hollywood is feared in folklore. A reminder that beauty and danger often walk hand in hand in human stories. Meanwhile, in high-altitude regions like the Andes or the Himalayas, blue eyes are rare not just genetically but evolutionarily and practical. Darker eyes are more resistant to UV damage, an advantage where the sun slices through thinner atmosphere. Blue eyes offer no such shield. And yet, thanks to centuries of intermixing and modern mobility, children are occasionally born with pale irises even there, sparking both awe and medical scrutiny. In one Peruvian village, a visiting aid worker with pale blue eyes unintentionally spooks children, who call her ghost eyes. Later, an elder tells her the community believes people with eyes like that see too much. She laughs it off, until one night she looks in a mirror by candlelight and startles herself. The reflection does seem otherworldly. It's moments like that which remind us how far perception can stretch beyond science. Because while eye colour can be explained down to alleles and melanin levels, the way we feel about it remains wrapped in story, myth, instinct. Blue eyes have been called portals, mirrors, spells and signs. Even now, in an age of retinal scans and AI vision tracking, we speak about them in poetry. And speaking of scans, eye-based biometrics are quietly becoming the new frontier in security tech. You walk through an airport and machines map the contours of your irises. Banks test two-factor verification using eye patterns. One startup even promises to use your eye as a secure wallet key. You blink, you pay. Science fiction, now available in beta. Funny, isn't it? 10,000 years ago, blue eyes were an accident. Now they're part of surveillance infrastructure. But even as the tech world marches forward, the cultural associations of blue eyes continue to shift. In some activist circles, blue eyes are viewed with suspicion, a marker of privilege, of colonial legacy, of default beauty norms that erase the richness of variation. In others, they're embraced as part of complex multiracial identities, no longer owned by one group but shared across many. In Brazil, one of the most genetically diverse countries in the world, it's not uncommon to find blue eyes paired with dark skin or tightly curled hair. That throws outsiders. But locals, they shrug. That's just Brazil. That's just what happens when everyone mixes freely. Historians still argue whether increased global blending will lead to the eventual fading of blue eyes entirely, or an even broader spread. Mathematically, recessive traits can persist if the carrier pool remains large. But preferences complicate things. If people continue to select for blue-eyed partners, consciously or not, the trait might thrive against the odds. Which brings us to the curious world of online dating. Algorithms on dating apps have, unintentionally or not, amplified aesthetic preferences. Filters that allow users to sort by hair and eye colour subtly reinforce biases. Profiles featuring blue eyes often receive more swipes in certain regions, especially when paired with fair skin. In countries where blue eyes are rare, they become a sort of status symbol, something to show off in selfies, a conversation starter that always lands. One influencer in Mumbai jokes that she wears blue contact lenses just to boost engagement. And it works. Every video where she wears them outpaces the others. People call them dreamy, she says, but it's not my dream. It's theirs. Because that's the truth buried in all of this. We don't just look at blue eyes, we project onto them. We see adventure, mystery, fragility, ice, sky, trust, danger. But what we're really seeing, what we're always seeing, is ourselves. A reflection of our own histories, hopes, and hang-ups. And blue eyes, silent witnesses that they are, simply keep watching. The sun sets again over a world both ancient and brand new, and somewhere in a city buzzing with neon and espresso machines, a child with startlingly pale blue eyes is born. Nurses gather around, not because she's the first baby of the day, but because those eyes, so rare in this particular corner of the world, seem almost backlit, like they're holding a light behind the lens. The mother laughs gently, exhausted but glowing, unaware that her daughter's eye colour will soon become the subject of whispered awe, Facebook posts and genetic curiosity. It's the same story told over and over again. In Morocco, in Nepal, in Peru, a child is born with an unexpected eye colour, and the village takes notice. Sometimes it's blamed on ancestry, sometimes on fate, sometimes quietly on the wrong father. But more often now it sparks a Google search. How do blue eyes happen? Turns out a tiny tweak on chromosome 15, one ancestral typo, one flicker of genetic fortune tucked inside the HERC2 gene, which in turn controls the OCA2 gene, like a light switch controlling another switch. That little malfunction prevents the full production of melanin in the iris, stripping it down to something more translucent, more open to the ambient light, more blue. It's the biological equivalent of a door left slightly ajar, and that somehow has led to centuries of poetry, suspicion, and song lyrics. The genetic explanation is fascinating, sure, but it rarely satisfies the people searching. Because the real question behind how do blue eyes happen is often why do I have them? Or why does he? Or more often than not, what does it mean? And what it means has changed dramatically across history. In ancient Rome, for instance, blue eyes were exotic but not unheard of. Roman soldiers who travelled north came back with stories of flaxen-haired women and fierce-eyed warriors whose stares seemed to pierce through helmets. Some of those soldiers brought wives or concubines back with them, seeding bits of northern DNA into southern bloodlines. And sometimes, generations later, a child was born with a pale gaze, a silent callback to some long-forgotten raid or romance. In medieval European courts, pale eyes were seen as noble, likely because the upper classes had more exposure to intermarriage and thus more recessive traits. In literature, heroines with eyes like the sea were often written as pure, innocent or magical. But elsewhere, especially in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultures, blue eyes remained suspicious. Anomalies, things to be protected against, or from. Historians still argue whether this reverence and revulsion for blue eyes stems from evolutionary wiring or cultural narrative layering. Probably both. Humans love patterns, and we love exceptions to patterns even more. And yet the same trait, this pale pigment scarcity, is used to sell perfume, frame political propaganda, and drive follower counts. In fact, in some corners of the internet, blue eyes have become a strange badge of identity, even ideology. On fringe forums, discussions of true blue lineage spiral into pseudoscience and supremacy talk. Genetics twisted into exclusion. This isn't new, sadly. Back in the early 20th century, certain ideologues obsessed over eye colour charts. They used calipers and photos to determine who was fit and who wasn't. One infamous propaganda film even claimed that blue eyes were the marker of an idealised master type, as if evolution had decided there was a finish line, as if melanin could measure morality. It's a grim chapter, and one that still casts shadows today. In some places, blue eyes still carry an awkward association with colonial narratives or rigid beauty standards imported via magazines and movies. A small inherited mutation, something that should be neutral, is used as shorthand for status. But the script is starting to flip. In India, a wave of Bollywood stars with deep brown eyes and golden skin redefined cinematic glamour. In Nigeria, fashion runways are filled with models who proudly pair dark complexions with natural dark eyes, radiating a beauty that's grounded, powerful, and unapologetic. Across Asia, more young people are rejecting coloured contacts and embracing their natural looks, reshaping trends from the inside. Still, the fascination with blue eyes lingers, not always in pursuit of superiority, but of mystery. One child in Shanghai asks her grandmother why a boy in her class has water eyes. The grandmother shrugs, saying, "Maybe he swallowed the sky." And the child nods, satisfied, because that makes about as much sense as the truth. Meanwhile, blue-eyed people themselves sometimes feel like reluctant participants in a spectacle. One woman in Cairo tells of being stopped on the street by strangers who want to look closer. She doesn't mind it until someone asks to touch her eyelids. Then it gets weird. Another man, adopted from Eastern Europe as a baby, grows up in Kenya and says he learned to hide his eyes behind sunglasses. Not because I was ashamed, he says, but because people looked at me like I was a riddle, and sometimes I just wanted to be a sentence. Yet for all the odd attention, there's a quiet beauty in the way these eyes connect people across continents. A girl in Argentina sees a YouTube video of a Mongolian boy with eyes like hers, and suddenly the world feels a little smaller. Stories travel in pigment, and sometimes they travel farther than the people who carry them. In recent years, documentaries have explored the blue-eyed diaspora, a loosely connected thread of populations around the globe where the trait appears sporadically, almost magically. Small towns in Chile, villages in Pakistan, nomadic groups in Central Asia, each with their own legends, each with their own explanations. In northern India, some locals believe blue eyes are the sign of an old soul. In rural Vietnam, there's a ghost story about a woman with eyes so pale they could hypnotize. And in Ethiopia, where mixed features occasionally appear after generations of hidden ancestry, there's a belief that blue eyes can see the rain coming. Of course, not everyone buys into the magic, but the magic keeps happening anyway. A boy born in a Rio favela with ice blue eyes becomes a minor celebrity in his neighbourhood. Local news does a feature. Photographers come knocking. He's too young to understand why his eyes are such a big deal. He just wants to play soccer, But already adults are trying to assign meaning to the way his gaze catches the light. Scientists caution against over-romanticizing genetic anomalies, but then again, scientists are human too. One researcher admits she still gets goosebumps when she sees a newborn's blue eyes for the first time, even though she knows they might turn hazel later. It's like a whisper from the past, she says, from a time when the world was colder, and someone's body adapted by accident, and now here it is again, blinking at me. Historians still argue whether the blue eye mutation provided any evolutionary advantage, or if it just drifted into prevalence through sheer happenstance. A genetic hitchhiker that got lucky. But then, isn't that how most stories begin? With an accident? A shift? A surprise? Maybe blue eyes are just evolution's poetic moment. A tiny detour in melanin production that lets us see the world a little differently, or be seen a little differently. And that brings us to art. From ancient mosaics to Renaissance portraits, from impressionist canvases to modern cinema, blue eyes have always been a painter's favourite subject. Easier to highlight, easier to contrast. On canvas, blue eyes draw the gaze. They pull you in like tidewater. Even Van Gogh, whose own eyes were a muted green, once obsessed over painting irises in exaggerated tones, saying that eyes are the windows not just to souls but to storms. Filmmakers agree. In movies, blue eyes are often used to signal vulnerability, alienness, or danger. Think of the glowing gaze of Paul Atreides in Dune, or the icy stare of androids in sci-fi. Think of the way close-ups linger on blue irises during emotional reveals. It's not the biology, it's the metaphor. Because really, that's what we've made them. Metaphors, a symbol of clarity or distance or otherness. And maybe that's why, even now, people still fall into long, strange conversations about what their eye colour says about them. Personality tests, zodiac overlays. If you have blue eyes, you're loyal, say some TikTok voiceovers. Others claim blue-eyed people are more sensitive to light, or more emotionally intense. It's part folklore, part pop psychology, part bedtime story. But somehow, it still works. Because in a world of digital sameness, there's something enchanting about a trait that you can't control, that you can't filter or fabricate. That just is. A soft glimmer in the iris, a glance that feels like a window into something just out of reach. Blue eyes remind us that we are not finished stories, that inside each of us there are whispers from ice ages and firelight, from villages we've never seen and languages we've never heard. That evolution didn't end, it just paused for a breath. And maybe, just maybe, it paused long enough for us to look each other in the eyes and remember that everything rare once began as something no one noticed at all. Back in the 1970s, somewhere in Iowa, a school teacher with honey brown eyes wheels a retro film projector into a darkened classroom. Her students groan, they'd rather be outside kicking footballs, but she hushes them gently. The film she plays is black and white, grainy and strangely intense. It's an experiment, a social one, a group of kids split by eye colour. The brown-eyed kids are told they're smarter, better. The blue-eyed kids are scolded and excluded. The kids squirm, uncomfortable with the roles. Some cry, some lash out. What they don't know is that they're making history. This teacher, Jane Elliott, has just conducted one of the most controversial and illuminating classroom experiments of the century. The blue eyes, brown eyes exercise becomes a media lightning rod, a spark for uncomfortable truths about discrimination and identity. She flips the roles the next day, and suddenly the formerly dominant kids feel the sting of arbitrary judgment. What does it mean to live inside a symbol? Elliott didn't choose blue eyes because they were bad or good. She chose them because they were visible, arbitrary, random, like all great human divides tend to be. But the world, as always, misreads the lesson. Some take the experiment and turn it into a case against bias. Others twist it into a new kind of sorting. The eye colour again becomes a banner, a metaphor, a scarlet letter. It's a reminder that human beings don't just evolve biologically, we evolve narratively. We assign meaning where none was intended. A pigment shift becomes a fate. A facial detail becomes a destiny. Fast forward to today, where social media is an eye colour factory. Instagram filters offer ocean blue overlays. TikTok creators play guess your eye colour's secret meaning. And a surprising number of people, given the option to digitally alter their gaze, choose blue. Not hazel, not emerald, blue. It's not just aesthetic, though that plays a role. It's aspirational, symbolic. Blue eyes, especially for people who don't naturally have them, feel like a kind of access pass. Like suddenly they're in on the secret, or maybe are the secret, and yet the truth of having blue eyes is a little less glamorous. Ask someone with blue eyes, and they might tell you that sunlight makes them squint, that their pupils often dilate too fast in dim light, that early mornings are brutal without sunglasses. The lack of melanin that gives the iris its frosty tint also means reduced light filtration. In extreme climates, that can be a disadvantage. In snow-covered landscapes, a nightmare. Light bounces everywhere. Reflections assault the cornea. You end up blinking like a Morse code signal. But evolution is never about perfection. It's about fit. And somewhere, thousands of years ago, this odd little mutation fit. A lower melanin level allowed more light to penetrate the eye, improving sight in darker northern winters. It was useful, survivable. That's all nature really asks for, not beauty, not prestige, just survivability. And yet, here we are, layering symbolism onto survivability like frosting on ancient cake. Consider how blue eyes are treated in stories. In fantasy novels, the chosen one often has piercing blue eyes. In romance stories, the eyes are stormy, icy, or pools of glacier. Never just blue, always dramatic, always loaded. The same isn't often said about brown or green eyes, which is ironic because statistically brown eyes are the default, the ancient mode, the global norm. But in fiction, they're often labelled as common, warm, or soft. They don't get the storm metaphors. They don't get icy vengeance. They get chocolate depths. Which is beautiful, but also, let's be honest, a little food-based. Historians still argue whether the aesthetic prioritisation of blue eyes is a colonial import or an organic response to rarity. Probably both, again. In ancient Persian poetry, blue eyes were described with suspicion, a sign of witchcraft, of otherworldliness. In Arabic folklore, jinn with pale eyes were feared, said to see things humans could not. Perhaps that's the point. Blue eyes seem to reflect light, not absorb it. They appear to mirror the world rather than take it in, like a surface of water too still to trust. In Japan, the phrase, "a cat with blue eyes," was once used to describe someone mysterious or hard to read. In parts of Eastern Europe, wolf eyes became slang for both seduction and danger. That ambivalence between attraction and threat has followed blue eyes for millennia. There's something uncanny about them, especially in unexpected places. When a child in Thailand is born with pale blue eyes, elders sometimes say it's a sign of reincarnation, that a soul from far away has returned. Whether that's reassuring or unsettling depends on the mood in the room. Back in the lab, scientists are still puzzling over the blue eye mutation's persistence. It's rare globally, only 8 to 10% of the population has it, but it's extraordinarily concentrated in certain regions. Estonia, Finland, Iceland, northern enclaves where daylight used to be a luxury. Researchers believe the mutation may have arisen once, possibly in a single ancestor about 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, and spread rapidly through a small, interconnected population. It's a curious thing. One mutation, now shared by millions, possibly all tracing back to a single person, the original blue-eyed human. They didn't know they were changing the aesthetic future of humanity. They probably just wanted to stay warm, survive the winter, and avoid saber-toothed trouble. We can't know much about them, gender, age, or even exact location, but we can imagine. A lone figure by a fire, ice crystals clinging to fur, looking out into the dusk with eyes that catch the firelight differently than their kins. The others notice. Maybe they say nothing. Maybe they whisper. Maybe they say, "That one sees far." And now, all these centuries later, their eyes blink out from children in Miami, teens in Seoul, elders in New Zealand. Evolution's quiet signature. But there's more to blue eyes than colour. The structure of the iris itself differs. The scattering of light, the Tyndall effect, the interplay of stroma, these microscopic dances create the illusion of colour. No blue pigment exists in the human eye. None. What you're seeing is an optical trick, a light show performed by collagen and physics. Isn't that wild? Blue eyes aren't really blue. They just appear blue because of how light bounces around inside the eye. It's the same reason the sky looks blue. A soft scam. Nature's special effect. So next time someone compliments your piercing baby blues, remember you're a walking mirage. But mirages have power, in culture, in mythology, in memory. Ask a grandmother in Poland why she wore her navy coat every Sunday and she'll say, "It matched my fiancé's eyes." He died in the war decades ago. She never remarried. The coat still hangs in her closet. Faded now, the same way his gaze lives only in old black and white photos. Ask a songwriter in Nashville what inspired her lyrics, and she'll shrug, then laugh. A man with eyes like lake ice. Bad for my heart. Great for my art. Ask a painter in Morocco why he always includes a figure with blue eyes in his murals. He won't answer. He'll just smile and say, everyone needs a guardian. Blue eyes, it seems, are often seen as witnesses to tragedy, to love, to long winters and brief burning summers. They endure, not just in DNA, but in metaphor. They're not better, not worse. Just lenses through which history sometimes peers back at itself. One of the most poetic theories proposed, albeit fringe and debated, is that the rise of blue eyes roughly coincides with the earliest stirrings of symbolic thought in humans. That as early hunter-gatherers began making art, carving bone flutes, painting cave walls, somewhere nearby a child was born with unfamiliar eyes. Maybe those eyes inspired myth, or caution, or just wonder. Historians still argue whether this correlation is mere coincidence or something deeper. There's no hard evidence that blue eyes made people more creative, but creativity, like mutation, thrives in anomalies, in the unexpected. And so we loop, again and again, back to meaning. A simple genetic quirk becomes a story told through centuries, from Icelandic lullabies to African field songs, from Nordic sagas to American screenplays, from a single nucleotide to a billion glances exchanged on subways and sidewalks. You see, the science is solid, but the soul of the matter, why it matters to us, isn't found under a microscope. It's found in the breath held when a baby opens its eyes for the first time and the room goes still. It's in that collective hush that says, without words, we've never seen that before, or maybe we have, but it still feels like magic. And maybe that's the quiet legacy of blue eyes. Not dominance, not divinity, just wonder, just rarity. A little ice in the gene pool that somehow stayed afloat. Like driftwood from the Ice Age, still circling the shores of modern life. The train station is unusually quiet this morning. A low mist curls over the tracks like breath held too long. A woman in a navy coat waits under the rusting eaves, her fingers wrapped around a coffee cup. The cup is too hot, the platform too cold. Her mind, somewhere between both, drifts to an old family story, one she's heard since childhood. Something about her great-grandmother and the war, and a soldier. And those famously blue eyes that didn't come from anywhere anyone could trace. Stories like this aren't rare. In fact, across families around the world, especially in Europe and parts of the Americas, you'll find blue eyes cropping up like stubborn flowers in otherwise brown-eyed fields. Sometimes they skip generations. Sometimes they pop up out of nowhere. Sometimes they seem to arrive on a gust of wind, unexpected, ghostly, and impossible to ignore. It's not always clear how. Geneticists will tell you the secret lies in the recessive nature of the gene. You need 2 copies, one from each parent, to express the trait. Blue eyes are the result of reduced melanin in the front layer of the iris, and this particular trait is associated with a variation in the OCA2 gene, sitting pretty on chromosome 15. But it's not alone. Other genes like HERC2 play supporting roles. Together they form a complex little orchestra playing a tune that says, "Less pigment here, please." But even with science in our pockets, those family surprises feel like magic. Take the story of the Romanian twins born in 1992. Fraternal, not identical. One had dark brown eyes, and the other, startling pale blue. The town whispered. Old women crossed themselves. Their mother, flustered and bemused, insisted both had the same father. DNA later confirmed it. But the mystery lingered. Not about genetics, but about fate. Why this child? Why those eyes? And here's where the human brain kicks in, layering meaning over randomness like a baker icing a lopsided cake. Those blue eyes, so rare in their village, became a story. The boy with the sky-coloured eyes grew up with a certain mythos. Expectations clung to him. Teachers noticed him more. Strangers smiled longer. Was it fair? Of course not. Was it real? Unfortunately, yes. Because whether we admit it or not, rarity shapes attention. In psychology, there's a phenomenon called the distinctiveness effect. The idea that rare traits, behaviours or appearances tend to be remembered more easily. That's why the kid with the blue hair in high school is instantly memorable, even if you never spoke to them. The same applies to blue eyes in regions where they're uncommon. They stand out whether they want to or not. Historians still argue whether this tendency has influenced power structures, whether leaders, rulers, or celebrities with blue eyes have benefited from subtle biases rooted in aesthetic novelty. It's hard to pin down. But the pattern does appear. Napoleon Bonaparte, often mythologized for his piercing blue gaze, weaponized his appearance. He posed for portraits with a calculated softness around the eyes, knowing the camera, well, the canvas, would do the rest. Marilyn Monroe, famously blue-eyed, knew how to frame her eyes with white eyeliner and soft focus lenses, creating a gaze that shimmered like cold fire. Frank Sinatra sang of baby blues while staring directly into the hearts of America. We have turned the eye colour into a kind of celebrity of its own. But that wasn't always the case. In medieval Europe, blue eyes were sometimes associated with supernatural phenomena. One Irish folk tale warns of a girl with frost for eyes and lies for breath, whose blue gaze could freeze cattle in their tracks. In Slavic myth, a creature called the rusalka, a water spirit, was said to lure men to watery graves with her pale eyes and long tangled hair. The implication: don't trust what looks like it doesn't belong. Don't trust what glows. These cautionary tales echo a fear of difference. Not hatred necessarily, just caution. That strange glint in someone's eye might mean magic, or danger, or both. Even the famed witch trials of early modern Europe occasionally referenced eye colour. Though the stereotype of the dark-haired, green-eyed temptress was common, some testimonies included blue eyes as evidence of unnatural coldness. One 1621 German pamphlet warns readers about maidens with blue or grey eyes who speak in riddles. That's a red flag if there ever was one. Of course, the Enlightenment tried to sand down some of that mysticism. Science stepped in with diagrams, charts, and classifications. Linnaeus and his botanical disciples tried to sort humans the same way they sorted plants, by colour, shape, origin. It was during this burst of taxonomical zeal that attempts were made to link eye colour with personality types, intelligence, even morality. Phrenology, the now defunct pseudoscience of skull-shape reading, sometimes looped eye colour into its flawed diagrams. Luminous eyes meant curiosity. Dark eyes indicated passion. These weren't conclusions. They were guesses dressed as theories. Still, they crept into literature, parenting guides, and racial theories. We may laugh at phrenology today, but the underlying instinct to categorise, to assign meaning to appearance, is alive and well. It's just better disguised. Fast forward to today's dating apps. Algorithms may not ask about eye colour, but user behaviour tells the story. Blue-eyed individuals still tend to get more right swipes on average, particularly in places where they're rare. Not because people explicitly search for it, but because the eye catches what is unexpected. Evolution, even in digital form, favours novelty, and yet the biological truth remains. There's nothing functionally superior about blue eyes. In fact, in some conditions they may be slightly more vulnerable. Studies suggest higher susceptibility to macular degeneration, more light sensitivity, and increased risk of certain cancers due to lower melanin protection. The same thing that makes them glitter also makes them fragile. It's like admiring a snowflake. Gorgeous, singular, but don't expect it to handle a heat wave. In the animal kingdom, blue eyes are similarly rare and symbolic. Siberian huskies, with their striking gaze, often look almost human. That's not anthropomorphism, it's an actual neurological response. The pale irises contrast sharply against darker fur, mimicking the sclera iris contrast in human eyes. Our brains recognise it as gaze direction, as intention. That's why a husky staring at you feels uncanny. In horses, blue eyes, sometimes called glass eyes, can appear in certain breeds like paints and cremellos. Historically, these horses were viewed with a mix of awe and suspicion. Some riders believed blue-eyed horses were more skittish or unlucky. No scientific basis, but the superstition lingered. Funny how eye colour alone can saddle a creature with centuries of assumptions. Even in birds, like the Steller's jay or certain owls, unusual eye hues are linked to mating rituals or social dominance. Eyes, across species, are signals of health, of status, of mood. That's why humans have such uniquely visible sclera, the whites of the eyes. It helps us follow each other's gaze, read intention, and build empathy. Blue eyes complicate that visibility. The lower contrast can make emotional reads more ambiguous. In poker, this might be an asset. In romantic tension, a nightmare. But here's a fun, slightly fringe theory. Some anthropologists speculate that the rise of lighter eyes and skin in northern populations may have had a social advantage beyond just vitamin D processing. It made emotional cues harder to read in low light. Think long, firelit winters, where deception or mystery could carry strategic value. In other words, maybe those blue eyes helped keep secrets in the dark. Historians still argue whether this hypothesis holds water, or whether it's just another story we like telling ourselves about difference. Regardless, the idea lingers, like campfire smoke in a wool coat. Somewhere along the line, science and symbolism collided. We discovered that all blue-eyed people may share a common ancestor, living around the Black Sea region, possibly as recently as 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Before that, everyone had brown eyes. Everyone. One mutation changed everything. Not a drastic change, not a miracle, just a single switch in the genetic code that affected melanin transport. A hiccup, really. And from that hiccup came not only aesthetic difference, but cultural ripples that shaped love stories, power dynamics, myths, and misunderstandings. It's a sharp reminder that evolution doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just blinks. Today we have coloured contact lenses, laser iris pigmentation surgery, and filters that let anyone have storm blue eyes for 15 seconds of internet fame. We can choose the illusion now. We can borrow that ancient mutation, even if only temporarily. But real blue eyes, they remain rare. Roughly 1 in 10 people on Earth has them, and their frequency continues to decline as populations intermix and recessive traits fade under dominant tides. Which raises a soft, haunting question. Are blue eyes disappearing? Maybe not anytime soon, but their global ratio is shrinking, slowly, like an old photograph fading in the sun. And perhaps that's part of the allure, that something so visible can also be so vulnerable, that you could hold a child with eyes the colour of glacier water and know, statistically, their great-grandchildren may never inherit that gaze. Not because it's unworthy, but because it's delicate, and life, like light, moves towards saturation. Still, people will remember. Stories will persist. Your great-aunt had blue eyes, someone will whisper over coffee, like pale sapphires. You'd have liked her. And in that whisper lives a memory, a gene, a glimpse of the Ice Age blinking patiently through time. A warm breeze curls through the alleys of Istanbul, ruffling laundry lines and pushing dust across worn cobblestones. In a dim corner of a family kitchen, a child leans over a photo album. His grandmother, tea in hand, points to an old photograph, sepia-toned and fraying at the edges. "That's my mother," she says softly, tapping the face of a young woman with light eyes, strikingly pale in contrast to the rest of the family. No one ever knew where those eyes came from. This, again, is not rare. From palaces to farmhouses, blue eyes have appeared like rogue waves in otherwise calm seas, uninvited, unexplained, and yet once noticed, they become unforgettable. In stories, in songs, in photographs yellowed by time, they stare out like ghosts that never quite left. And if we follow them, if we truly trace the threads backward, we find ourselves once more back in the marshy edges of the Black Sea. Not at a place of drama, not some cinematic Eden, but a landscape of modest beauty and chill winds. It's here, around 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, that scientists believe the genetic mutation for blue eyes first flickers into existence in a single individual. One person, one change, like a match struck in dusk. They likely weren't special in any outward way. They weren't kings or priests or inventors. But their body carried a variant, specifically in the HERK2 gene, that silenced a piece of the OCA2 gene responsible for producing melanin in the iris. That meant less pigment, less brown, more light refraction. The iris, now short on colour, scattered light like the sky does. Result? Blue. It's worth remembering that the eye doesn't actually contain blue pigment. Blue eyes are an optical illusion, a trick of physics, just like how the ocean appears blue even though it's clear. It's all about the way light interacts with structure. You're not looking at a colour, you're looking at a phenomenon. This is where science gets romantic. That first blue-eyed person likely never knew they were different, not profoundly. But their peers might have noticed, stared a little too long, maybe even whispered. Difference always makes ripples, even if gently. Whether it was seen as a sign, a flaw, or a blessing is lost to time. We can only guess. Historians still debate whether this mutation arose independently or spread through a tightly knit population due to genetic drift, when certain traits proliferate in small, isolated groups not because they're beneficial, but because of chance. Like a coin tossed a few too many times and landing heads just enough to matter. Imagine a village where this individual lives. They have children. Maybe several of them carry the same gene variant. And slowly, over generations, a new pattern emerges. In this microcosm of humanity, blue eyes become just common enough to feel ordinary. But once migration begins, across mountains, rivers and borders, that trait sets off into new terrain, and once again becomes rare. It's this rarity that fuels mystique. In anthropological studies, traits that stand out often acquire symbolic weight. The people of ancient Sumer, for example, created lapis lazuli figurines with wide, staring blue eyes. Lapis, a vibrant blue stone, was not local. It came from what is now Afghanistan, expensive, exotic and hard to get. To own something blue was to touch power. So too with eyes. Ancient Egyptian art often depicted their gods with coal-lined eyes, but in certain regions and certain tombs you'll find representations with pale irises, sometimes filled in with turquoise stones or glass. Was it symbolic, artistic license, or a nod to something more real, something witnessed in foreigners, traders or rare community members? We can't know, but we can know how humanity reacts to the uncommon. In later eras, explorers wrote about encountering blue-eyed tribes in unexpected places. Ancient Greek historians, never ones to let fact get in the way of a good yarn, wrote of Scythians with light eyes and hair, and even located them as semi-divine in certain texts. The Chinese chronicler Zhang Qian described unusual physical features among the people of Fergana in Central Asia, noting their wide eyes and long noses, likely early contact with Indo-European populations who had already spread the mutation. These intersections birthed legends. The Tocharians, a now extinct Indo-European people who lived in what's now Western China, left behind mummies preserved by desert air. Their bodies, over 3,000 years old, had light hair, and some with pale, hauntingly blue eyes preserved in photos and studies. Their existence baffles modern scholars, not because they shouldn't be there genetically, but because their culture carried European and Asian traits in equal measure. It complicates tidy migration stories. Historians still argue whether the Tocharians were remnants of earlier Indo-European waves or a hybrid society formed through trade and wandering. And their eyes? Just one piece of the enigma. But as with all human things, culture shapes biology just as much as biology shapes culture. Blue eyes didn't offer survival advantage in any grand sense. In the tundra or northern forests, pale skin helped with vitamin D synthesis, but blue eyes, they simply came along for the ride, like a fringe benefit, or perhaps a cosmetic hitchhiker. Still, as people began to group by region, the frequency of blue eyes became a defining visual trait in Northern and Eastern Europe. In areas like the Baltic states, Scandinavia, and parts of Russia, the concentration of blue eyes skyrocketed. Not because those people were more evolved, an absurd and dangerous claim, but because of genetic bottlenecks, limited gene flow, and sheer isolation over millennia. Some modern studies estimate that in Lithuania, Estonia and Finland, over 80% of the population has blue eyes. That's nearly the opposite of the global average, where only 8 to 10% do. So in those places, blue isn't special, it's normal. Which raises a philosophical question. When something rare becomes common, does it lose its magic? Possibly. But humans find ways to create new meaning. In literature, pale eyes became shorthand for otherworldliness. Consider the elves of Tolkien's Middle-earth, glacial gazes, ethereal beauty, ancient wisdom, or the icy stare of a fantasy villain implying both cruelty and control. Writers learned quickly, blue eyes make characters seem not quite us, or perhaps too much like us for comfort. But blue eyes also took on romantic weight. From the ballads of medieval troubadours to the tortured love poems of 19th century Europe, blue eyes were described as the windows of longing, the mirrors of summer, the gates of the soul. It became a colour of emotional transparency, fragility, deep feeling, even when that had nothing to do with the actual person behind them. Projection is powerful and unfair. That unfairness echoes in modern conversations about beauty standards. For decades, centuries even, Eurocentric features, including blue eyes, were upheld in media, art and advertising as the ideal. Magazines, billboards, television, all teemed with light-eyed models, reinforcing a global bias that left many feeling invisible. It wasn't accidental. Colonization spread not just economic and political systems, but aesthetic ones. In countries from India to Brazil to Kenya, generations grew up believing that to be beautiful was to look a little more European, a little more fair, a little more light-eyed. This damage isn't fixed by including one blue-eyed model of colour in a commercial. It runs deep. Across cultures, it altered how people saw themselves, and each other. Parents wishing blue eyes onto their children. Schools praising lighter features. Artists painting saints and angels with pale irises, even in regions where no one naturally has them. But things are shifting. Now, you'll find fashion embracing the full spectrum of eye colours. Amber, hazel, jet black. Even the so-called muddy brown that once got sidelined is finding its due. More people are calling out the silent hierarchies that once ruled casting calls and book covers. Representation is changing. Not perfectly, but persistently. Still, the mystique of blue eyes lingers. And sometimes, it shows up in unexpected places. Like the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific, where a high percentage of Melanesians, people with dark skin and tightly curled hair, naturally have bright blue eyes. No European ancestry, just a separate mutation altogether. It's a genetic surprise, discovered to stem from a different gene than the one affecting European populations, a separate path to the same outcome. Nature, once again, breaking its own rules just to keep us guessing. There's something deeply comforting in that even in the face of charts and labs and genome sequencing, the world retains a little whimsy, a little trickery, that you could sail across oceans and still find familiar colours in unfamiliar faces. We are, all of us, variations on a theme. That blue-eyed gene, while recessive, still floats through billions of people silently, waiting. Maybe for the right match, maybe never to awaken. But it's there, like an echo, a folded note in our DNA that says, yes, this too is possible. And maybe that's the final magic of blue eyes, not in their colour, but in their fragility. In the way they remind us that difference isn't destiny, but detail. That ancestry is full of surprises, that the past is written in pigment and pattern, and the way light bends through a transparent lens, and that sometimes a glance is all it takes to remember how strange and beautiful it is to be human. The blue-eyed gene, for all its poetry and puzzle, is just one page in a massive evolutionary ledger, an accidental quirk in the long experiment of being human. But like so many quirks, it refuses to be quiet. Even when buried deep in our genetic script, it rises from time to time to remind us that evolution doesn't always play by the rules of logic. Sometimes it plays by the rules of light. Somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, where morning fog rolls over mossy cliffs and sheep blink slow and curious under grey skies, a shepherd brushes frost off his window and catches his reflection. His eyes, pale blue like winter shadows on a frozen pond, gleam back at him. He doesn't think much of it. To him, those eyes are just his. But behind them lies a 10,000-year-old accident, passed from Anatolia to the steppes to the Isles, crossing continents like a wandering whisper. The story of blue eyes continues not just in the eyes themselves, but in what they've come to mean across generations. Their rise in frequency in some populations, and virtual disappearance in others, is shaped not just by nature, but by nurture, desire, and memory, and sometimes by war. Take World War II, for example. The twisted ideals of Nazi racial science placed a grotesque premium on traits like blonde hair and blue eyes. These superficial characteristics, cherry-picked from misunderstood anthropology and bastardized evolutionary theory, were elevated into symbols of superiority. What was once an evolutionary fluke became propaganda, evidence they claimed of some master lineage. But history remembers differently. Blue eyes, under their banner, became both a mark of privilege and a burden of expectation. People were sorted, categorized, and judged for them. Survivors of occupied nations later spoke of being identified, or spared, based on eye colour. And others, wrongly assumed to be of the preferred type, were roped into machinery they never believed in. Historians still argue whether the Nazi obsession with blue eyes was rooted in real science or pure mythologizing. Either way, it shows how dangerous the romanticization of genetic traits can become. The idea that something as arbitrary as an iris hue could define worthiness, it should have been laughable, but instead it became lethal. After the war, there was a reckoning, not just with ideology, but with image. In Western media, blue eyes retained their pedestal, but cracks began to form. As the world rebuilt and reconsidered, more diverse portrayals began to creep into literature, cinema, and art. The icy stare of the idealized European began to share the stage with warmer, richer, and more varied gazes. Still, some patterns held on longer than they should have. In Hollywood, for decades, leading men and women, especially in romantic roles, often had blue eyes. It became almost an unspoken casting law. Directors sought out that flash of cerulean that read well on camera, caught the light just right, and made audiences swoon. Aesthetics, they argued. Practicality. But beneath it lay a deeper cultural coding, a hangover from centuries of artistic preference and colonial legacy. Even Disney played the game. Most of the early princesses, Cinderella, Aurora, Elsa, much later, were drawn with strikingly pale eyes. It was subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, reinforcement of an ideal shaped not by evolution, but by editorial choice. Now contrast that with the global south. Places where blue eyes remain so rare, they become paradoxically fetishized. In parts of India, Pakistan, and the Middle East, children born with pale eyes in otherwise dark-eyed families are sometimes treated as omens, blessed or cursed depending on local law. Stories abound of strangers wanting to touch or photograph them, as though they were living relics. In Ethiopia's Wollo province, some communities trace noble lineage through light-eyed ancestors, tying it to stories of old Arab or Turkish settlers. Whether these links are accurate or romanticized, they reflect a real emotional attachment to the trait. Blue eyes, when surrounded by brown ones, draw attention. They signal something different, even when that difference is meaningless. And then there's the role of art, how it has preserved, exaggerated, and sometimes fabricated the presence of blue eyes in history. Think of the Renaissance, when European painters, flush with patronage and pigment, began depicting religious figures with pale eyes, even in biblical scenes set in the Middle East. Jesus, Mary, the Apostles, figures born and imagined in a sun-drenched, dark-eyed region, were often rendered with fair complexions and light eyes. Why? Because artists painted what flattered the viewer, and most patrons at the time were European aristocrats. The gaze in these portraits wasn't meant to reflect historical accuracy, it was meant to reflect you, the viewer. You, with your pale skin and blue eyes, were being told that divinity looked like you. It wasn't truth, it was marketing. Even in the modern age, blue eyes have been twisted into commodity. Think of coloured contact lenses. The demand, particularly in East and Southeast Asia, the Middle East and Latin America, surged in the 1990s and early 2000s. Ads promised instant allure, mystery, exotic charm. Magazines ran spreads of celebrities who transformed their look with azure lenses. It became a fashion accessory as transient as lipstick or mascara. But beneath that surface lies an ancient desire to try on something unusual, to slip into a different version of self. And maybe, in a world where difference can be both danger and beauty, blue eyes offer a fantasy of otherness that feels safe, controlled, reversible. Of course, this raises the question, what happens when we stop seeing blue eyes as special? When their meaning is no longer wrapped in myth or longing or bias? Is that freedom or loss? In some places that's already happening. In the Baltics, as mentioned earlier, where blue eyes are more common than brown, there's no particular allure, it's just what people look like. There, the fascination turns outward, to Mediterranean or East Asian features, often romanticised in novels and soap operas. The exotic, it turns out, is always somewhere else. And yet, blue eyes still retain a universal symbolic punch. Consider the digital age. In video games and CGI-driven movies, characters with glowing or ice blue eyes often signal something extraordinary. Magic, mutation, power, it's a trope, a visual shorthand for not normal. Blue eyes, exaggerated to unnatural brightness, have become code for intensity, danger, or depth. In role-playing games, a glacier gaze might hint at an icy soul or a painful past. In superhero films, it often means the character has ascended, touched by alien tech, divine force, or radioactive quirk. And in anime, blue-eyed characters often exude nobility, melancholy, or both. Cultural storytelling retools the myth again and again. Even artificial intelligence isn't immune. Developers designing humanoid robots often choose blue eyes. It's not rational, it's aesthetic. The pale iris, they argue, is easier to animate for expressive contrast. But one wonders, if we had evolved with purple or crimson eyes, would our machines be built to match those instead? And yes, there's still the occasional twist of biology that keeps us on our toes. In rare medical cases, people have sectoral heterochromia, where part of the iris is blue, while the rest is another colour. Like the eye couldn't decide. David Bowie famously had anisocoria, uneven pupils, not heterochromia, but the myth persisted that he had one blue eye. The legend stuck because it matched the image. Bowie as an alien prince, a starman, a one-man tribe of other. The more unusual the eyes, the easier the myth takes root. But here's the quiet truth. Eyes change. In infants, especially those of European descent, blue eyes are common at birth because melanin hasn't yet settled. As they age, their eyes darken. The final shade often isn't fixed until the child is 2 or 3. Parents wait with curiosity, watching those pale grey pools shift and deepen, like the world slowly deciding how it wants to see itself. In rare cases, even adults see eye colour shift due to injury, disease, or ageing. Some people claim stress changed their eyes, a poetic idea, though not well supported scientifically. Still, in the soft terrain between biology and perception, things are never quite fixed. We're not just watching the world, we're being watched by it. Reflected, refracted, coloured, and coloured by it in return. And speaking of perception, there's one last, lingering marvel. The way blue eyes interact with light isn't just structural, it's subjective. Studies have shown that blue-eyed people may be more sensitive to bright environments, more prone to glare. They also tend to squint more in direct sunlight. It's not a flaw, just a trait. The same physics that makes their eyes appear vivid also lets more light pass through the iris. So perhaps, in a metaphorical twist, blue-eyed people really do see the world differently, at least on sunny days. That brings us to now. Across the globe, somewhere in a crowded subway, a girl with slate blue eyes scrolls through her phone. In a desert village, a grandmother stirs tea with cloudy blue irises that have faded with age. In a classroom in Argentina, a boy with one green eye and one blue explains Punnett squares with giddy pride. And in a lab in Copenhagen, a researcher pulls up a gene sequence and sees that same HERC2 switch, the molecular ancestor of it all. We have traced the story far, but we haven't reached the end. Because genes don't stop. They don't rest. They mutate, combine, vanish, reappear. Blue eyes could fade from humanity one day. Or due to global mixing, they could pop up in places we'd never expect, like forgotten stars blinking on in distant skies. Because evolution isn't linear, it's jazz. One note, struck a little differently 10,000 years ago, became a motif. It travelled the earth in silence, hidden behind eyelashes and gazes and generations. And now, you've seen where it's been. Tomorrow you might see it again. In a stranger on a train, a friend's newborn, a mirror. Or maybe you already have it. Maybe the starlight lives behind your lids. The tale of blue eyes, though spun across continents and centuries, is ultimately one of quiet rebellion. Nature's subtle defiance of uniformity. Even now it glides forward through our modern lives, slipping past our conversations, our selfies, our medical charts and our myths. Like a thread woven into a vast and ever-changing fabric. In cities lit by neon and noise, where human beings swirl together in ever-denser hives, blue eyes still manage to pause the rhythm. On Tokyo subways or São Paulo dance floors, on New York streets or Cairo cafes, those rare pale irises catch ambient light and reflect it back with an almost uncanny glow. Not because they are better, just different. In a sea of brown and black and hazel, they remain reminders that even after millennia of mixing and migration, something strange and old can still shimmer through. That's the power of contrast. It's not just about visibility, it's about perception. A single drop of blue in a world of earth tones feels electric, but here's where the narrative bends again. That rarity, it's shrinking. Intercontinental travel, global media, interracial relationships on the rise. The Earth, once a patchwork of isolated genetic clusters, is becoming a great swirling mosaic. And as populations blend more freely than ever before in history, blue eyes, once clustered in small cold corners of Europe, are turning up in unexpected places. A blonde-haired child born in Jakarta, born in us, a freckled boy with sky-coloured eyes laughing in a village near Accra. It's not magic, it's inheritance, it's probability meeting opportunity. Geneticists still puzzle over just how blue eyes will fare over the next few centuries. Some models suggest the frequency may decrease, simply because brown-eye genes are more dominant. Others point out that recessive traits can linger quietly for dozens of generations, waiting patiently for two copies to meet. So the trait may hide, but not disappear. And sometimes it springs forth in the most delightful surprise. A baby born to two brown-eyed parents who, thanks to the shadows in their ancestry, opens its eyes to the world in pale ice. The numbers are constantly changing. In the United States, for example, blue eyes once dominated. In the early 20th century, over half the American population had blue eyes. By the early 2000s, that number had dropped below 20%. A shift not driven by extinction, but by integration. Some might see that as loss, others see it as proof of progress. Because when you think about it, our fixation on eye colour, blue, brown, green, grey, is less about the eyes themselves and more about what we project into them. Strength, mystery, intellect, nobility, sensuality, danger. The iris becomes a canvas, the person behind it, a frame for story. Even in courtrooms, believe it or not, eye colour has made its subtle mark. Studies in the 1990s explored how juries perceived defendants with lighter versus darker eyes. The findings were predictably unsettling. Blue-eyed defendants were often seen as more innocent, less threatening. A sobering reminder that bias doesn't need to speak aloud to wield power. It lives in the snap judgments, the silent assumptions. Psychologists call this the halo effect. Attractive features, whether culturally learned or evolutionarily imprinted, can colour our perception of an individual's character. And blue eyes, with their relative rarity and brightness, sometimes benefit from that reflexive, unconscious favouritism. Which brings us to something more tender: romance. Let's not pretend we haven't all been momentarily undone by a stranger's glance. A gaze held a fraction too long, a flash of colour across the room. For some, blue eyes carry a charge, a magnetic tug that bypasses logic. Are they deeper, more piercing, more readable? Science offers one theory, that the lower melanin in blue eyes lets more light pass through, making pupils more visible, reactions more transparent. Perhaps that vulnerability, real or imagined, invites connection. Or maybe it's the centuries of poetry and music whispering that love should look like a summer sky. Remember the songs? Don't it make my brown eyes blue? Behind blue eyes, blue-eyed girl. The eyes are always watching, or being watched. But here's the twist. Blue eyes, for all their mystique, aren't invulnerable. They're more susceptible to UV damage, more prone to light sensitivity. In high-altitude cultures or sun-scorched deserts, darker eyes have the advantage. That's evolution again, quietly selecting traits suited for their environment. Form follows function. And yet, function isn't always the loudest voice in the room. Fashion often drowns it out. In modern beauty culture, blue eyes still linger on the ideal spectrum in some regions. Makeup lines design palettes to make blue eyes pop. Models with ice-coloured gazes dominate cover spreads in magazines across Europe and parts of Asia. Dating apps see spikes in swipe rights for users who mention blue eyes in their bios. It's not universal, and it's certainly not fair. But it tells us something, that even in an age of enlightenment and education, myth and memory still whisper behind our preferences. Still, there's pushback. Social movements around the world, especially in post-colonial and multi-ethnic societies, are pushing against narrow beauty ideals, embracing melanin, elevating local features, rewriting the scripts that said light was better, fair was beautiful, blue was best. In South Africa, skin tone pride campaigns now sit alongside eye colour affirmations. In India, filmmakers are casting leads with dusky complexions and deep brown eyes. In Brazil, a rising tide of Afro-Brazilian influences is reshaping what's seen as aspirational. They're not erasing blue eyes, but they're refusing to worship them. Because it's not about devaluing one trait, it's about restoring balance to the scale, and that's the point. Evolution doesn't care what's trendy. It only cares what survives, what reproduces, what fits. Culture, however, is far more dramatic. It paints meaning over the surface, spins it into fashion, sells it through generations. Biology gives you a gene, culture gives you a mirror, and mirrors, well, they've been lying to us for years. Take the story of Queen Elizabeth I of England. Pale skin, red hair, and reportedly piercing blue-grey eyes. She turned those features, already rare and striking, into symbols of divine right. Portraits of her emphasise the icy clarity of her gaze, suggesting wisdom, vigilance, and royal detachment. But who decided that light eyes meant clarity, or that a cold stare translated into power? Probably a portrait artist paid by the palace. From pharaohs to emperors, blue eyes, when they appeared, were often mythologized. Alexander the Great, for example, was said to have one blue eye and one brown. It might have been a simple genetic quirk, or it might have been legend added to accentuate his divine status. Heroes, after all, aren't allowed to be ordinary, and yet the most ordinary among us carry the same gene. The same mutation that arose in a hunter-gatherer by the Black Sea is now found in children racing scooters in suburban Atlanta, or sipping mate in Buenos Aires, or peeking through lattices in Marrakesh. A single base pair swap. That's all it was. That's all it took. Of course, blue eyes aren't the only trait tied to such powerful stories. Red hair, left-handedness, freckles, dimples, all minor traits by genetic standards, but explosive in cultural terms. We love the rare, we fall for the different, and sometimes we fear it. In medieval Europe, people with unusual features, pale eyes, crooked teeth, mismatched irises, were sometimes accused of witchcraft or possession. As recently as the 1800s, folklore in parts of Eastern Europe held that blue-eyed women were cool-blooded, less likely to weep, more likely to hex. Science rolled its eyes. Culture wrote more tales. Even now, conspiracy corners of the internet spin theories about blue-eyed bloodlines, secret rulers, reptilian hybrids, alien descendants. Most of it is nonsense wrapped in pseudoscience, but it speaks to a larger hunger, the need to make sense of strangeness, to explain rarity through story. But let's not end on nonsense. Let's end on wonder. Imagine this. A child born in 2012-25. In a world blanketed by smart glass and augmented contact lenses, she opens her eyes for the first time, and they are the same blue seen in ancient skulls from Denmark, in portraits of kings, in lullabies sung in Norwegian winters. Her parents are from Malaysia and Nigeria. The gene passed down silently, secretly, winding its way through time like a genetic message in a bottle. And now here she is, breathing, blinking, seeing. The earth turns. The light catches her iris just right. And somewhere, 10,000 years ago, that first carrier of the mutation, who didn't know what blue eyes were or why they had them, might have gazed into a rippling pool and wondered the same thing we still do. Why me? Why this? Why now? Maybe there's no reason. Maybe it's all just chance. Or maybe, tucked inside the randomness, there's something beautiful about being improbable. Something human. So the journey of blue eyes glides toward its resting note. Not an end, exactly, but more like the soft decrescendo of a lullaby, the moment when questions soften into dreams. But before we drift fully into sleep, let's follow one more path, one that curls back around to where we started, to that silent moment when something ancient shifted. It begins, perhaps, with a single flicker, a cell in the early embryo of a man or woman who lived near the Black Sea coast, maybe 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. That cell makes a tiny error, an almost imperceptible change in the OCA2 gene. This isn't the sort of mutation that causes disease or deformity. It's subtle, just enough to downregulate melanin production in the iris, just enough to scatter light in a new way, just enough to be called blue. And here's the marvellous thing, no one would have noticed. Not really, not at first. The child grows up among kin who hunt and gather and trade along the waterways. Their eyes are brown or dark hazel, their skin tans under the sun. But this child, their eyes stay light, clearer, cooler. Maybe the family chalks it up to ancestry, or the gods, or just one of those things. Because who has time to think about eye colour when your daily battles are about shelter and meat, and not freezing to death? Still someone notices. A lover perhaps, or a stranger in a nearby tribe. And slowly, through unions and offspring, the trait carries forward. Not fast, not dramatically, but steadily. A drop at a time, millennia pass. The first blue-eyed people spread into Europe, where shorter daylight hours and colder climates favour lighter pigmentation. It's not that blue eyes help you survive, but they help you stand out. And in small communities, where most people are related and sameness becomes the norm, a little novelty goes a long way. Here comes sexual selection again, tapping evolution on the shoulder and saying, "Let's try this." Anthropologists still debate whether the spread of blue eyes was driven more by migration patterns or by mating preference, maybe both. But the data tells a curious tale of how something so minor, so seemingly cosmetic, can sweep through populations simply because it's charming. That's evolution's secret sauce. It's not always about the strongest or smartest. Sometimes it's about who gets noticed. By the time farming spreads across Europe, blue eyes are no longer a fluke, they're a trend. Particularly in the Baltic region, in what is now modern-day Estonia, Latvia and Finland. Today, over 80% of people in those areas still carry the gene. Elsewhere, the frequency drops. Southern Europeans tend to have darker eyes, thanks to both geography and gene flow from Africa and the Middle East. In northern India, isolated communities still occasionally show blue eyes, echoes of ancient Indo-European ancestry. In parts of Central Asia, and even the Middle East, the gene flickers in and out, a testament to thousands of years of trade and intermarriage. But here's the odd thing. Blue eyes are not always blue. Step into a well-lit room, and they might gleam grey. In the shadow, they can seem green. In tears, they deepen. In sunlight, they glow. That's because they're not actually blue in the way a peacock feather or a sapphire is blue. There's no pigment in a blue iris. The colour is created by light scattering, what scientists call the Tyndall effect, similar to the way the sky appears blue. Think about that for a moment. Every time someone looks into blue eyes, they're seeing an illusion, a trick of light, an absence dressed as colour. Romantic, isn't it? Now, leap across time and land in modern Iceland. A geneticist scrolls through pages of DNA samples, comparing eye colour distributions across the country's unique population. Iceland is a dreamland for geneticists, an island with limited migration, well-documented genealogies, and a relatively homogeneous gene pool. What they find confirms what historians have long suspected. Blue eyes arrived early and stayed. Over 70% of Icelanders have them, and yet their blue eyes don't all look the same. Some are pale like snowmelt, others are icy steel, a few shimmer with violet hues, rare but real, and they're all tied to that same ancestral mutation. But something stranger emerges. In Iceland, scientists discover that blue eyes tend to cluster with other traits, certain hair colours, certain sensitivity to light, even some psychological profiles. It's not deterministic, of course. You can't read someone's mind through their iris, but there are patterns, and those patterns suggest that the genes for eye colour may sit close on the chromosome to genes for other traits. Traits we're still unravelling, which brings us to the new frontier, polygenic traits. See, eye colour isn't just one gene. The OCA2 mutation may have started it all, but today scientists recognise at least 16 genes involved in shaping eye colour. Some control melanin production, others affect the structure of the iris. Some are regulatory switches that toggle on and off depending on environmental triggers. In essence, your eye colour is a symphony, lots of instruments playing at once, and sometimes the same sheet music produces slightly different songs. That's why two blue-eyed parents might have a brown-eyed child, or why green eyes, a hybrid between blue and brown, can run wild through a family tree. Genes don't follow human logic, they don't ask permission, and they don't mind breaking the rules. Now look closer. Even within the category of blue, there are dozens of variations. Sky blue, cornflower, slate, ice, denim. The shade can shift depending on mood, lighting, or what you're wearing. It's why photographers obsess over catching the sparkle. And it's why poets keep writing about them. But let's widen the frame once more. In the age of CRISPR and genetic editing, we're entering a world where eye colour might be a choice. Already, clinics offer embryo screening for traits like eye and hair colour. Controversial, yes, but technically feasible. Someday, perhaps, parents will select traits not just to avoid disease, but to design appearances. And then what? Will blue eyes lose their charm if anyone can buy them? Will rarity still feel special when it's manufactured? It's a slippery slope. Beauty, when too easily purchased, often loses value. But nature, stubborn as always, finds a way to stay surprising. Already the gene pool is remixing. New eye colours are emerging. Hazel gold with green flecks, deep grey with blue halos, unnameable shades that make colour charts look silly. And that's good. That's how evolution keeps the story going. One last tale before we close. In 2018, a Syrian refugee child with pale blue eyes is photographed in a dusty camp outside Aleppo. The image goes viral. Her eyes, wide and luminous against her dust-streaked skin, seem almost painted. People speculate about ancestry, about recessive traits, about divine intervention. But the truth is simpler. Her mother has green eyes. Her grandfather reportedly had blue. The mutation rode quietly through generations of olive-toned skin and dark lashes until, in the chaos of war, it decided to shine again. That's the final reminder. Blue eyes are not European. They are not royal. They are not a marker of any single race or place. They are a wrinkle in the code, a hiccup in the pigment system, a lucky coin toss that turned into legend. And whether you have them or not, whether they glimmer in your family or remain a mystery, their story belongs to all of us. Because inside our cells, blue-eyed, brown-eyed, or somewhere in between, we all carry evidence of migrations, mutations, and minglings. We are, each of us, a walking museum of evolutionary accidents and ancient romances, and maybe that's why we stare into each other's eyes, not just for connection, but for history. Now, hush. Let your breath slow just a bit. We've wandered far tonight, haven't we? Across epochs and icy rivers, through genetic codes and candlelit myths, all to chase the glint of a single rare eye colour. And yet, the deeper we went, the more we saw that it was never really about the eyes. It was about where they led us, about what they revealed in the folds of time. So let the noise of the day fall away. Picture the hunter by the Black Sea, cradling a newborn with that strange bright gaze. Picture the medieval queen, still as marble, painted to look timeless. Picture the cafe in modern Helsinki, where a child with blue eyes leans over her hot cocoa, blinking sleepily. The world turns, eyes open, eyes close, and so does this story. In a few moments you'll drift off, and maybe, just maybe, you'll dream in shifting shades of blue. Maybe you'll find yourself standing in the snow beside a stranger with familiar eyes. Or maybe you'll be underwater, watching light scatter and dance, just like it does in the iris of someone unforgettable. Whatever comes, let it come gently. Because in this quiet space between waking and sleep, we carry more than just stories. We carry echoes of ancestors, of science, of serendipity. And some of those echoes shimmer pale like the sky before dawn. Sweet dreams, you curious soul.